I fitted false hands for a living for most of my working life, and the morning I woke in Averny, I was wearing the worst one I had ever seen, which was a wrapped stump and a length of tarred cord. The sentence had already been carried out on a body that was not mine. For a theft the man who owned that body before me had genuinely committed. The man who ordered it was standing over me with his ledger open. Corwin Vale, Crown Fine Assessor of the Ashmere Assize, reading out what the Auric name still owed him now that the hand had been taken. 11 silver inside 90 days, and if the balance went unpaid, my sister went into bonded service as the payment. And my sister was 15 and standing 6 feet from me with a tally board held flat against her chest. Her name was Mira Auric. I had known her about 40 heartbeats and already understood exactly what the number chalked under her name was for. You need one rule to follow the next few hours. In this kingdom, the right hand is the sentence, and any man in that market could read my whole record from 20 paces without asking a single question. Vale called the arrangement square. He said it twice while his clerks wrote, and the second time he said it, he was looking at the tool chest against the yard wall. Auric tools, he said, assessed at 3 silver against the balance, which leaves 11, which is square, and I will hear no argument on the valuation from a man who is no longer a tradesman. I stood up. That was all I did, and 2 of the clerks stopped writing to watch me do it, because a man who has just been cut usually stays on the stones through the reading. The chest was oak and held every file, rasp, punch, drift, and clamp the family owned, and Mira got her mouth open before I got mine open. 3 silver is the price of that chest standing empty, she said. The contents were listed in their own column at the last assessment, and the assessment was witnessed, and you are reading us the wrong column on purpose. Vale did not look at her once. He told bailiff Hugh Corliss to have the chest out of the yard before the tide turned, and Corliss took it up by both handles and carried it through a crowd that opened for him. Then Vale entered my sister on the record. Security against the Auric balance, he said, and the clerk repeated it back to him in the same voice a man uses for cartage. I want that written where I can read it, I told him. The sum, the days, and her name in one line, so nobody adds to it later. He liked that. He turned the ledger and let me look, and I read 11 silver, 90 days, Mira Auric, security, and I have never been so grateful for another man's arrogance. A written number cannot grow quietly. It can only be paid down. And I had just watched him show me his own accounting in front of 40 witnesses who could all count. Mira waited until we were past the block and then said the balance was hers as much as mine, and she would hear how I planned to pay it before I did anything clever. I told her I did not have a plan yet. She said that was the first honest thing anybody in that yard had said all morning, and went to work, because her piecework did not wait for family disasters. The man at the yard wall had watched all of it. He had a stump like mine, older, and a wooden begging bowl held between his knees because he could not hold it any other way. Bram Otley, he said, 19 years a pikeman, 4 years sitting here, and I will save you a week of walking if you will sit down and listen for the length of it. He counted it off on the fingers he had left. No craft hall would take me. No oath I swore was binding. No license in my name. No testimony unless a whole man stood beside me and said it too. Then what is left, I asked him, because I was not going to sit against that wall, and I wanted to know the exact size of the hole I was standing in. Al de body he sene, if it starts, day labor, he said. Anything a beast could do, and trade, because the crown has never worked out how to stop 2 men swapping goods without coin passing where a clerk can see it. He said that last piece slowly, the way a man says a thing he has turned over for 4 years and never had a use for. I thanked him and went to the grain dock, which was the only paid work inside a mile. Quill Bay ran the loading there and measured his whole life in tides. He looked at my stump for as long as it took him to price it, which was no time at all. Barges do not wait, he said. Sacks are 200 pounds wet, and I need both hands on the rail, or you go in the water, and I lose an afternoon fishing you out. I asked for the night shift, which is the worst shift, and he said the night shift was the same sacks in the dark, and he was not going to be the man who explained my drowning to a magistrate. Then he took 2 coppers out of his own purse and held them out in front of 11 loaders, and told me to buy bread and stop standing where the men could see me. That was kindly meant, And it was also the moment I stopped being a man with a trade and became a thing the doc felt sorry for. I told him I would take the work or nothing and left the coppers in his hand, and the loaders laughed, and one of them asked whether I wanted the bread cut up small for me. I went looking for a broken barrow instead, because a yard that size always has one, and found 3 behind the cooper's shed with their axles gone. My inventory that afternoon ran to 4 items: 1 iron cart pin, straight, about as thick as my thumb, 1 leather strap off a broken harness, 1 cooper's band, sprung, hoop of soft iron, a dead man's whetstone in my own pocket. What I lacked was a forge, a vise, a right hand, and permission. What blocked everything was the fact that a strap around a stump slides the moment the load comes on, and every false hand I ever built failed at exactly that point. So I did not build a hand. I built a socket, badly, out of the cooper's band beaten round a fence post, lined with the strap doubled twice, and I bent the cart pin into a hook and seated it cold. It took me until dark and cost me the skin off 3 knuckles, and the first time I put my stump into it, the whole thing slid off and hit the ground like a dropped tool. The second time, I ran the strap over my shoulder instead of around my arm, which is the whole trick, and which I knew because I had watched men fail at it for years in a life nobody here could check. Then I walked to the trough, hooked a full pail over the iron, lifted it clear of the ground, and carried it 30 paces without spilling it. Mira was standing at the corner of the shed and had been there long enough to have watched the first attempt as well. She said nothing. She filled a second pail and set it in front of me to see whether I could do it twice. I did it twice. She wrote something on the tally board, and when I asked her what, she said the date, because everything that turns into money starts on a date. The barges ran that night. I knew the tide because Bay had told me it himself while he was refusing me, which is the sort of thing a man gives away when he has decided you are harmless. I found him at the rail at dusk and made him an offer he could not lose on. Half rate 1 night, no pay at all if I dropped a sack in the water, and he could dismiss me at any point without argument. Bay asked what I would do if the hook tore my arm off. I said he would have his afternoon back and the entertainment of watching it, and he called that the worst sales pitch he had ever heard and put me on the plank. The loader they set against me was called Doran, and he had both hands and a bet running with 3 of the men before I reached the deck. Nobody at that dock understood the thing I was actually doing, including me at the time. A sack does not care about fingers. A sack cares about the line the weight takes from your shoulder to the ground. 2 hands let you cheat that line. You grab, you correct, you shuffle, you correct again. A hook corrects nothing, so it makes you set the load right the first time, every time, or drop it. I set my line, and I did not correct, and I went up the plank while Doran was still adjusting his grip, and by the 4th trip, he was breathing through his mouth. Bay stopped tallying at some point and started watching, and the men stopped calling out, and somewhere around the 9th sack, somebody said quietly that the marked man was 2 ahead. 14-11, when the last of it was on the cart. Doran sat down on a bollard and told me to my face that he had never in his life been beaten up a plank by a man with 1 arm, and he was going to need a while with that. Half rate was 2 coppers for the night. Bay put 4 in my hand and said the second 2 were because he was not going to be the man who paid the yard's entertainment at a discount. Then he booked me. Every night the barges run for the rest of the season, he said, at 3 coppers until you drop something, and I want you standing here before the tide and not after it. 3 coppers is what you pay a boy, I said. 4, the same as any loader on that plank, and I will take the wet grain that jams under the rail that nobody else will touch. He looked at the cart, then at Doran, then at me, and said 4 and the wet grain, and that if I ever mentioned the pity money in front of his men, he would find a reason to change his mind. Haldun was still awake at his forge. He looked at my hook for a long moment, then quoted me the price of clean bar iron, which was outrageous. I asked for credit. He said no, and he said it without any particular cruelty, and he explained that a forge dies in a bad winter, and his own bad winter was 1 refused debt away. Scrap by weight, he said, 2 coppers the pound for what is in that barrel, and I do not warrant any of it, and I do not care what you make with it. I asked what a false hand cost in Ashmere, since I was apparently in the trade again, and he priced the latter for me without looking up from his tongs. A strapped hook, I 8 silver, a cabled hand that closes 16, and you will not find one in Ashmere. Then he said the last one carefully, that a limb a man can actually use costs whatever the man has. which is the only honest price in the trade. I bought 2 pounds of scrap, and it took all 4 coppers, and I walked home owing my own sister the arithmetic. Mira had the tally board on the table when I came in, and she had already turned it face down, which told me everything before she said a word. Piecework and mending, she said. 9 coppers on a good week, 7 on a normal one. 90 days of normal weeks is 5 silver and a bit, against 11. She had been running that number for 6 days and telling nobody. I asked her why, and she said because I had been sitting in a yard bleeding, and there had been no useful moment to say it. I told her that I would take every count she gave me, straight from then on, good or bad, and that I would not manage her. She said she would hold me to it, and she wrote the 4 coppers in and the iron out under the date she had already put down. Bram was still at the yard wall when I went back with the scrap at midnight, and he was running a fever, and the skin under his rope strap had gone. The color skin goes before a bone setter starts talking about the elbow. He had been carrying every load on the soft flesh at the end of the bone for 4 years, because that was where the strap sat, and nobody had ever told him different. I opened the strap. He counted under his breath the whole time, which I learned later was how he got through anything, and I moved the bearing point back onto the flat of the bone below the joint and rebuilt the wrap from there with the harness leather. Take the weight on bone, I said. Flesh cannot carry a load, it can only be crushed under one, and everything I built today works because I put the line where the bone already is. He put his weight on the wall and stood up off it, and the pain came off his face in a way I have seen exactly 4 times since. Then he asked the question I had no answer for. If the bone carries it, he said, why can I feel the wall through the wood just now, for a heartbeat, when I have not felt anything through it in 4 years? I told him that was the leather warming. I said it with total confidence, and it was the least true thing I said all day, and I lay awake on the auric floor, turning it over until the light came. Corliss came to the assize board next morning with a stick of chalk and a list, and made sure I was watching him do it, because a bailiff without an audience is only a man doing paperwork. He wrote the auric name in the column for repeat risks, and the yard clerk read the wording aloud for the crowd, which was that a fine assessed against a marked repeat name is doubled at the next assize. 89 days left, 11 silver owed, 2 pounds of scrap iron, and 1 man in Ashmere who could feel a stone wall through a piece of dead wood and did not know why. The hook tore my stump open on the 4th night, at the top of the plank, with 200 pounds of wet barley on my shoulder and 11 loaders watching to see whether I would let go of it. I did not let go of it. I got it onto the cart, and then I sat down on the cart rail and looked at what was running out of the wrap, and Quilbay came over and told me to be at the rail again tomorrow, or lose the booking. The cause had a name, and the name was not weakness. The Cooper's band had a seam in it, and the seam sat on the ridge of bone at the end of my arm, and every sack drove that seam a little deeper into one point the width of a coin. Bone carries a load. I had told Bram that, and it was true. And it was also half a truth, because bone carries a load spread and cuts through flesh when you hand it all to one edge. So the answer was a shell that touched everywhere at once, shaped to my own arm and nothing else, which in a trade with a forge and a proper vice takes an afternoon, and which I was going to have to do with a knife. I could not work the next night, and I knew it by dawn. I sent Mira to the dock to tell Bay the truth rather than a story, because a man who lies about his body once gets tested on it forever. She came back with his answer, which was that tides do not care, and I had 2 nights before he filled the place, and that he had said the second half in a tone she thought I should hear about. 2 nights to build a socket meant carving a form of my own arm in wood, and beating iron around it, and I had no wood, no carver, and 2 pounds of scrap. Pitch solved the first piece of it for me, which is not a sentence I ever expected to write. He was a yellow dog with a crushed hind leg who lived behind the Cooper's shed and stole from anyone slower than he was. He had been dragging that leg for a month, and the yard had a running argument about whether somebody should drown him. Mira had been feeding him crusts out of our own ration, which she reported to me as a line on the board, 4 coppers of bread across 3 weeks. I made him a leg out of a barrel stave, padded with the last of the harness leather, strapped over the shoulder in front of the hip, because the trick is the same trick on a dog as on a man. He bit me twice. On the third attempt, he stood on it, and then he took 2 steps, and then he went across that yard after a gull at a speed that put 4 grown loaders on their feet. Half the dock watched a 3-legged dog run on 4, and I watched the loaders, because a man who has just seen a thing work stops arguing about whether it can be done and starts asking what it costs. Then Salter asked what it cost. She had been standing at the shed corner with a carving satchel, and she had a stump like mine, and she asked her question in the flat voice of somebody who has been refused a great deal that week. The market master had turned her off her own stall an hour before. A marked woman could not hold a stall license, he had told her, and he had told her in front of the stall holders, and one of them had bought her tools at half price on the spot. I offered to speak for her. It was the stupidest thing I did that week, and she stopped me before I finished the sentence. I do not want a whole man to speak for me, she said. I want to trade with you. You need a form carved to your arm, and I have carved every seal blank in this market for 9 years, and I want a socket like the one you are about to build for yourself. I asked her what she carved with now. She said badly, and with a knife lashed to her wrist, and that if I told her the tolerance, she could still hold a curve better than any smith in Ashmere. We settled it in about 4 sentences. She carved the form of my arm and one of her own. I built 2 sockets, and neither of us called it charity or a sale, which as it turned out was the most useful accident of my life. She carved my form in 3 hours out of a block of pear wood off her own bench. She ran her thumb over the finished curve before she gave it to me, and told me the low side was a whisker proud because my arm was not symmetrical, which it is not, and which nobody had ever noticed before. Hal Dunn watched me come through his door with a wooden arm under my elbow and put his price up before I reached the anvil. 4 coppers the pound now, he said. Same barrel, same scrap, and do not look at me like that. It went up because you came back, and it will go up again if you come back a 3rd time. I told him I could not pay 4. He said that was not his difficulty. I said it was going to be, because I was about to become the only steady buyer of the worst iron in his yard, and he was about to be my only supplier, and that we could either bleed each other or make an arrangement. He asked what kind of arrangement. I offered him a share of the first 3 fittings I ever got paid for, whatever they paid in, coin or grain or work, 1/3 of it, on his own weighing. Hal Dunn is the most honest, greedy man I have ever met. He thought about it for the length of a breath and then said 1/3 of the first 3, plus the scrap at 3 coppers, and he wanted the terms said out loud in front of his apprentice, so neither of us could improve them later. Done, I said, and his apprentice wrote it on the forged slate, and that slate is the first contract the trade ever had. The socket came off the form at dusk. Beaten iron, 1/4 of the weight of the old band, curved to the flat of the bone below the joint, with the pear wood lining glued in and the leather over that. I put my arm into it, and there was no point of pressure anywhere. The load went into the whole surface at once, and the arm carried it like an arm, and I stood in that forge and laughed at nothing until Hal told me to take it outside. What is desi duas was that's high sifying. I was at Bay's Rail the 2nd night with an hour to spare, and I worked the full tide, was sunsumgens a full tiles day, and when I unwrapped the arm afterwards, the skin was red across the whole flat of it and broken nowhere. Bay counted my trips off his tally without saying anything, and at the end he said the place was mine while the barges ran, and asked what I had done differently, and I told him I had stopped hanging my arm on one corner of itself. Mira put both nights on the board and turned it round so I could see the column she had started that morning, headed with the 4 coppers from the first night and standing at 20 now, which she read out as 1 silver and 8, which is not 11 silver. The lot came the next morning, and it came from Bram Otley, sitting against a wall with a bowl between his knees, and he has never once let me forget it. I was trying to work out how a hook stays closed on a load, since a hook only holds what gravity keeps in it. Bram was watching from the wall and counting under his breath, and he said that a pike does not hold itself, the shoulder holds it, and that a soldier who grips with his hand is a soldier with no pike by noon. So I ran a cord from the socket up over the opposite shoulder in a harness and tied it to the moving jaw of the hook. And when the shoulder came forward, the jaw closed and stayed closed while the shoulder held. It is the whole cable hand. Every fitted man in the kingdom wears it now, and the man who worked it out was a beggar sitting against a yard wall who thought he was talking about pikes. I fitted Bram before I fitted myself again, because I had 2 sockets, and Wren's was the 2nd, and Bram's arm and mine were near enough that his old form fitted with a wedge. Yospor so 9 times. Sat on an upturned pail with his stump held out, and I set the socket and drew the harness and told him to bring his shoulder forward, and he brought it forward, and the jaw came shut on nothing at all. Then he did it again on the pewter cup he had been begging with for 4 years. It came up off the ground, and the yard went quiet in that particular way, and Bram Otley held his own cup in his own right hand for the first time since the year he stopped being a soldier. He gripped it wrong. He had it by the rim like a man picking up something dead, and the cup went over and spilled water down his knee, and he looked at it and started to laugh and could not stop for a while. 19 years I carried a pike, he said, and I have to learn to hold a cup. Then he did learn it in about 40 minutes, and then he stood up and poured for me. Ren came for hers that afternoon and paid her trade before she would put her arm in it, which meant 3 more carved forms set on my bench, done to sizes I had not asked for yet. She took the socket, she took the jaw, and she refused the harness cord until I had explained twice why the shoulder had to do the closing, because she was not going to wear a thing she could not repair herself on a road. Then she lashed her carving knife into the jaw instead of into her wrist, and cut a seal blank in front of me, and the shaving came off in one curl. She looked at it for a while. Then she said that when she took a mark, she was going to take it for the work and not for the pity, and that if I ever asked the market master for a favor on her behalf again, she would carve for somebody else. Corliss found us at the wall an hour later, which tells you exactly how long a private thing stays private in a town this size. That is not your trade. You are a laborer with a mark on the assize board and no craft license in any hall in this kingdom, and the halls will hear about this by market day. I told him no coin had passed. He said that was cute and that he was writing it down anyway, and he wrote it down standing up in that little book of his, and then he asked how much a thing like that would go for in a town that had no rule against it yet. I have thought about that question a great deal since. At the time, I thought he was fishing for a bribe. 3 men came off the yard wall the next morning and stood in front of me in a line, which is what a queue looks like when nobody involved has ever been served before. I had iron for one. I said so plainly, and I said what the price was, which was that whoever took it worked my bench 30 days, because I had 2 hands between me and the socket work, and I needed 4. 2 of them wanted to know how much coin instead. The third was a miller called Garrow Lisk, marked for a short sack he had not filled, and he asked what tolerance I held my sockets to, and whether the jaw could be geared to close harder on the same shoulder pull. I fitted Garrow. It took a day and a night, and by the end of the 2nd week, he had put a cam in the jaw linkage that doubled the grip without a single extra ounce of pull, and he explained it to me as though I might not follow. Annika Toll priced it for the yard before I could. She was a widow selling her husband's tools off a barrow, and she watched Garrow pick up a full sack with the new jaw, and she did her arithmetic out loud, the way market women do. That is a man off the parish and back on a wage, she said. 40 loaves a month he was costing this yard in charity, and now he earns his own. And you people stood here for a year deciding whether to drown a dog. Nobody answered her. 2 of the loaders bought bread from her barrow instead, which is how a yard apologizes. Guildmaster Osric Payne posted his notice on market day, nailed to the assize board under the fine list. And Simro the clerk read it aloud twice because the 2nd reading was for the people who could not read the first. No person shall fit, fix, sell, or repair a false limb within the town of Ashmere without a license from the halls, and no license shall be issued to a marked man, and any work so done is unlicensed work and finable at the assize. Payne stood there while it was read. He is not a corrupt man, which I did not know yet and would have hated to hear, and he told the crowd plainly that a hall member with a wife and 4 children could not compete with a marked man working for bread. By dusk, somebody had chalked 11 names on the yard wall under the notice, in 11 different hands, in a column, the way the assize lists debts. Not one of those 11 came to me that week, and not one of them said aloud what the list was for, and I stood in front of it in the dark with a cup Bram had poured for me and counted iron I did not have. 9 of the 11 names came to the yard on the morning of the assize, which was 7 weeks after Payne nailed his notice up, and they came before light so nobody would see them arriving. I had iron for 1 socket and about half of a second. I told them so standing on the cart rail, out loud, because a queue that is lied to once never forms again. Drover called Seth asked how long the half would take to become a whole. I said that depended on a smith who put his price up every time he saw my face, and one of them laughed, and that laugh was the first thing the yard wall had given me for nothing. They put their names in order themselves. Garrow ran it, on the slate, by who had work waiting that a hand would win back, which is not how I would have ordered it, and was better than how I would have ordered it. Then Bram asked me the question he had been sitting on for 7 weeks, which was whether he had felt that wall, or whether a man wants a thing badly enough to invent it. I had no answer. What I had was a stump, a socket, and a knight with nothing else in it. So I sat on the floor of the workshop and took hold of my own arm with my own remaining hand and started working. The socket was on. I put my left hand around the whole joint, iron and arm together, and I pressed until I could feel the shape of my own bone through the flesh, and then I held it and did not move. Nothing happened for a long time. I changed the angle of the grip about 40 times, and the 40th time I set my thumb along the line where the load runs when the arm carries weight, and the arm went quiet in a way an arm has no business going quiet. Then the hook was mine, not a tool on the end of my arm. Mine, the way the arm above it was mine, so that when the iron touched the floorboard, I felt the board, dry and cold and rough across the grain. It lasted 4 heartbeats. I counted them because a man in that trade counts everything, and on the 5th, the whole thing slipped and the hook was a piece of iron on a strap again, and my hand was shaking. I sat there until Mira got up. She found me on the floor at gray light and asked whether I was hurt, and I told her I had felt the floor through a cart pin, and she put her hand on my forehead to check for fever, and I did not blame her for it. I tried it on Bram at noon in front of nobody, with the door shut and Pitch asleep across it, and it failed twice. The first time I had my hand around the soft of his arm, and he felt nothing at all and said so, and did not pretend otherwise, which is why I fit him first with everything. The second time I pressed harder and got further, and he said there was something like water running under the skin, and then it was gone, and he sat back and rubbed the place and asked me what I had been holding. Flesh. Both times. Flesh, because his arm has more of it than mine, and my thumb never reached the line I had been holding on myself. The seat wants bone, or it wants nothing, and the difference between the 2 men in that room was about a finger's width of meat. So I went to the bone setter and asked her to cut it open for me. I want that on the record with everything else, because it is the worst idea I have ever taken seriously. Naldi Sarah had a sick room behind the tannery, and she was setting a boy's wrist when I came in, and she made me wait until it was splinted, which I now understand was the first of her lessons. You want me to open a healed stump, she said, on a man of 50 in a town with no clean water, so you can put your thumb on his bone. Say the rest of it out loud and listen to yourself say it. I said I could seat it in a quarter of an hour. She asked what I would do about the wound after my quarter of an hour, and I said it would heal, and she asked me how many stumps I had watched go bad from the inside. 3, I told her, in my old trade. She said she had buried 9, and that 7 of them died a month after the surgeon told the family it had gone beautifully, and she was not going to hand me a 10th to prove a point about feeling. Then she told me exactly where the wall was, which I had not expected her to do at all. No cutting, no boring, no opening, and nothing that presses hard enough for long enough to kill skin. Anything on the outside of the body, she said, is my own business and none of hers. I asked her whether she would come and watch it once, if I did it her way. She said no. She said she would watch it twice, or not at all, and until then, I was to stop telling the yard she had approved of anything. Her boundary was correct, and it also handed me the answer, because a boundary is a shape, and if you cannot go through flesh, you can go around it. I built a ring. 2 curved iron plates on the inside of the socket, set where the bone runs closest to the surface on either side, drawn together by a screw against a strap so that the pressure finds bone through the meat instead of crushing it. It took the rest of the day. Ren carved the pads, Garrow cut the screw thread, and Hal charged me for the plate and then took 4 coppers off the price because he wanted to see whether it worked, which is as near to charity as that man goes. Bram sat down for it after dark. I set the ring, and I took hold of the whole joint over the iron and found the line, and this time my thumb was pressing on a plate that was pressing on bone. He said, quite calmly, in the voice of a man remarking on the weather to somebody he does not know well, that the pail was cold. He had picked the water pail up with the hook while I was still adjusting the screw, and he was holding it, and he was reporting the temperature of the water inside it as though it were an ordinary thing to know. Then he stopped talking. I have known Bram Otley for a good while now, and I have heard him talk under fire, and I have never heard him go quiet the way he went quiet on that floor. He put the pail down. He picked up the pewter cup instead, the one he had begged with, and he wrapped the hook around it and held it in front of his face for a long time and did not say a word. Tea was warm in it. He told me afterwards that he had not felt warm in that hand since a summer he could name by the harvest, and that he had been carrying the shape of it in his head all that time like a debt. That was all of it. One old man, one cup, no crowd, no witnesses of any use, and a yard asleep outside the door. The 4 silver in the house was iron money. It was the 2nd socket, and the 3rd, and most of the 4th. And Garros said so at the bench that night, and he was not wrong. I told him the iron would still be for sale next month, and my sister would not. He said that was true, and also that 8 men were standing in a queue built on the promise that the iron was coming, and he was not wrong about that either. The assize sat the next morning at the hour after prayer, and Corwin Vale opened by moving on my sister 8 weeks before the 90 days were up. The household produces nothing, he told the hall. No trade, no license, no wage on any roll in this town, and where there is no production, the security is called in early, which is square, and which the clerk will now write down. Mira stood up before I could. She had brought the tally board into the assize hall, and she read it out to the room, and her voice did not move once. 31 nights at Bay's dock at 4 coppers, she said, which is 124. 56 more from my own piecework since the sentence. 92 of it spent on food and rent, and 40 on iron from Hal Dunn's yard. That leaves 48 coppers, she said, which is 4 silver, which is standing in a purse in my brother's hand 2 feet from your ledger. The hall got very interested in the ceiling. Perrin Ash, the assize scribe, wrote all of it down, because his entire nature is to write down what is true and let the trouble arrive afterwards. I put the 4 silver on the table in front of Vale. I told him it had been earned at his own dock, in his own town, across 31 nights of tide work, with the hand his court took off me. Took it. He said the sum was received against the balance, and moved to proceed with the security, and his clerk had already dipped the pen, and I asked him to state the balance first. He said 11 silver. I asked him to state it again with the payment applied, and I asked Perrin Ash to read the column back, and Perrin read the column back, because he had it written and he was not going to pretend otherwise in front of 9 clerks. 7 silver. Vale said 7 silver out loud in his own hall, with his own clerks writing, and every man in that room heard a fine assessor lose 4 silver he had already spent in his head. The bond stands deferred to the next assize, he said, and he said it fast, and he did not say square, and he has not used that word in front of me since. Mira sat down. I have never seen anybody look less triumphant and more like somebody who has just put a plank across a hole they have been walking around for 8 weeks. Vale had his answer before the noon bell. He could not touch coin he could not trace, so he stopped chasing coin. A fitting handed over for 30 days of bench work, he ruled, is a sale in everything but the naming, and a sale of an unlicensed good is finable under Guildmaster Payne's own notice, and he would be assessing the receivers rather than the maker. I told him a sale needs a price and a buyer, and neither exists when 2 men swap labor, and that his own statute says a marked man may trade. Trade goods, he said, not licensed work. The hand is the good, and the 30 days are the price, and I have written both into the record, and if you dislike my wording, take it up with the man who wrote the notice, since it is his. Perrin Ash looked up at that, and did not say anything, and made a small mark in his own margin, and I did not understand what I was looking at for a long time afterwards. He fined Garrow Lisk 1 silver and Rensalter 1 silver in front of the market, on the day they had each been fitted, and he invited the hall to consider what the next one would cost. By dusk, there were 2 names left on the yard wall. Somebody had come along the line with a wet rag and taken 9 of them off, and I did not blame a single one of the 9, and I stood there and read the gap where they had been. Wren paid her silver and came back the same evening with 4 more carved forms and set them on my bench without being asked. She said she was not going to be priced off a wall she had put her own name on. The second name still up there was not one of the 9. It belonged to a 14-year-old called Odo Fenn, who was born with his right hand missing and had therefore never been sentenced for anything in his life. He came and explained the distinction to me at length, since he had clearly been waiting weeks to use it. He was not a marked man. He was a boy with no hand, which is a different word in the statute, and Vale could not fine him for receiving because there was no sentence to hang the fine on. I asked him what he did. He said he ran and named the 4 fastest ways out of Ashmere in order, with the times, including one across the tannery roofs that took a quarter of an hour off the Ford Road, and he wanted paying in coin and not in bread. Garrow paid his by selling the last of his mill gear, and then he asked whether the bench work he owed me still stood, and I said it did, and he said good, because he had an idea about the jaw. Hal came to find me that night, which he never does, because a smith who leaves his forge after dark is a smith with something on his mind. Corliss had been in his yard asking questions, he said. Not about me, about the drawings. What a pattern like that would fetch from a smith in Columns Ford or Stonewick or anywhere else with no notice nailed to its assize board, and whether Hal thought a man could carry it out of the valley in his head. I asked Hal what he had told him. He said he had told Corliss that iron is his trade and gossip is not, and then he stood in my doorway a while longer and said that he had also told him a number, because a man asked him a price, and he is a man who answers prices. Wren Salter came to the bench 3 days after she paid her fine, and told me I had been trying to save the wrong thing. You keep looking for a way to be paid, she said. Stop. There is no wording anywhere in that notice about a man working on a bench he owns, and the whole of Vale's ruling rests on 2 people and a price. And if there is no buyer, there is no sale. I asked what she expected me to do with that, since Vale had just written the wording himself. She said the answer was to stop owning the bench. Her arrangement had 4 moving parts, and she had clearly been turning it over since the day she was fined. The bench is held in common by everybody fitted on it. A person fitted is a holder from that hour. A holder works 30 days on the common bench. Nobody buys anything. Nobody pays anybody. There is no receiver, no good, and no price for Vale to assess. And a marked man who cannot hold a license can absolutely hold a share of a workbench in a yard, because the Crown has never once objected to poor men owning something worthless together. I argued with her for most of an hour, because giving away the bench meant giving away the only thing standing between my sister and a bonded service contract, and I said so plainly. She said that was exactly the trouble with me, that every fitting I had made so far had produced a man who owed me something, and that a yard full of men who owe the marked maker is a yard the Crown can buy out from under him in one afternoon. Make them owners, she said. Owners argue with you at the top of their voices in front of a hall. Debtors just stand there and wait to be sold. Aaron Ash wrote the holding out for us for nothing, on a single sheet, in the wording the Crown uses for a fishing weir, held in common by a village, which is old and dull, and has survived 4 kings. He would not accept coin for it. He said the record simply had to be correct, and that, if the assize was going to have an argument about it, he would rather the argument was with a properly drawn instrument than with something I had scratched on a slate. Then he said one more thing, on his way out, which I did not think about for another 6 months. He said a great deal of what governs this town was written by men who are dead, and that most of the living ones have never read any of it. The first 4 holders came in on the same week. Garrow was already there. Seth the drover came off the yard wall, and a rope maker called Nib, and a woman named Halla Reeve, who had lost hers for short weight at a bread stall and had opinions about scales I did not yet understand the value of. 4 sockets, 4 cable locks, 12 days of work, and every hour of it done on a bench that no longer belonged to me, and by the end of it, the yard had something that looked like a workshop. Nothing in my life prepared me for what happens when 5 people who have all been useless for years get access to a set of calipers at once. They measured everything. Each other's arms, the door frame, the dog, the cooper's shed, and one another's sockets down to 1/3 of a barleycorn. Then they argued about the results with the specific joy of people who have not been allowed to be right about anything in front of witnesses for a very long time. Seth priced the yard. Hala weighed everything on the bench and found 2 of my own weights light and told the whole yard about it before breakfast. Garrow rebuilt the jaw linkage twice in a week and then rebuilt mine without asking and improved it. I lost 4 days to arguments about tolerances and gained about 2 years of capability, and I would take that trade again. Wren came to the bench at the end of that week and told me what she wanted built, and it was not a hook. She wanted fingers, separate ones, graded differently from each other, because a carver needs to know what she is touching more than she needs to crush it, and she had already worked out that the seat which told Bram his cup was warm would tell her what a surface was doing. I built them over 11 days, 4 fingers on a common cable, each one with a different pad, the little finger stiff, the index thin as a rasp handle, all of it seated on the ring against the bone, and every one of them tuned separately, which took 3 hours and left me sitting on the floor. She held a pear wood block afterwards and ran the tip of the iron index down the grain and told me the block had been cut in the 3rd year of its growth ring and had a knot 2 fingers deep in it that no eye could see. Then she found the knot with a chisel and split the block to show me, and she was right. And Garrow made her do it 3 more times with blocks he chose himself before he would believe it. Within a day, she was reading carving by touch, faster than she had ever read it by eye. Within a week, she was doing something nobody had asked for, which was walking the market with her hand out, touching things. She touched the market's own weights, the set the market master keeps under seal, that every stallholder is measured against, that decide whether a widow selling flour has cheated the town. She came back and told me the 2-pound weight was wrong. Not light, she said, which anybody can be, stamped. The crown stamp on the base had been cut by hand and cut badly, and the edge of the letters had a burr her finger caught on. I asked how sure she was. She said she had run her thumb over the true stamp on the assize door on her way back, and it was not the same tool, and then she told me the name of the man who had held the market weights before they came under seal, which was a cousin of bailiff Hugh Corliss. As Yarni Nanmo I Elbokayan Han Abo Elbopa Alto Tai war sign besides, and Bolkala weighed them, 2-pound weight, 1 pound and 13 ounces, 4-pound weight, 3 and 11. The half-pound was honest, which I took to mean somebody had run out of patience. Every stallholder in Ashmere had been paying dues on weights that shorted them by an ounce in every pound for as long as anybody could remember, and the shorted ounces had been collected as fines. We did not go to Vale with it. Vale would have taken the weights, held an inquiry, and lost the evidence in a cupboard, and I had learned that much by then. We went to the market master on a market morning with the stallholders standing there, and Wren put the 2-pound weight down on his own table beside a scale, and Hala put a true 2-pound weight on the other pan, and nobody said anything at all. The pan moved. 40 people watched a pan move and did the arithmetic themselves, out loud in the way a market does, which is loudly and with names attached. The market master is a decent enough coward. He asked, in front of all of them, how a marked woman came to be handling sealed weights. Wren told him she could not hold a stall license in his market, so she had a good deal of time on her hands, and that if he wanted an answer about the weights, he would have to take it from a woman he had turned off her own pitch in front of witnesses. He gave her the stall back inside the hour, not out of shame, whatever the yard says. He gave it back because the alternative was standing in that market explaining a false crown stamp on his own table, and one of those 2 things cost him nothing. Wren took the license and hung her carved seal blank over the pitch, and she made a point of telling the stallholders that she had not been given anything. She had traded a false weight for a true stall, which is a transaction. Hala got the weights job. The market master appointed her to check them monthly at a wage of 6 coppers a week, because there was now precisely one person in Ashmere the town trusted to say what a thing weighed, and she was marked and everybody knew it. I want to be clear about what that was worth, because coin does not measure it. A marked woman held a license in that market for the first time since the statute was written, and she held it because of a thing her iron fingers told her. Guildmaster Osric Payne closed the next door 6 days later, and unlike Vale, he did it competently and without any pleasure in it at all. No marked person, his notice said, shall carry, bear, or use the tools of any craft within the walls, precincts, or yards of any hall of this town, not fitting. Tools, all of them. Everywhere the halls have a roof. That took the bench out of the cooper's shed, which stood on hall ground, and which I had been renting on a nod for 2 coppers a week. I went to see him about it, and he received me, which surprised me. Payne is a heavy, careful man, who has been guildmaster for 11 years, and he offered me a chair, and then he explained his position without one word of apology in it. On his Spain fright. At HRI have 42 members, he said. Between them, they keep about 190 people fed. You can put a hand on a man for the cost of the iron and his own labor, and I cannot. and if I do nothing at all, then in 3 years my members are the ones sitting on the yard wall. I asked him whether he had ever seen a fitted man work. He said that was not the question, and he was not going to be turned round by a demonstration, and that his job was wages, not wonders. Then he said the thing I have quoted back to myself in every hard room since. He said, "I am not your enemy because you are wrong. I am your enemy because you are right, and it is going to cost my people everything. And I would rather be beaten by you honestly than manage the retreat." So, the bench moved into the open yard, on the stones by the block, where the town does its sentencing, because that ground belongs to the crown and not to any hall. We worked in the wind for 4 days and lost a full set of pads to the rain and gained 3 more holders, because a bench in a shed is a rumor, and a bench in the middle of the yard is an advertisement nobody can take down. Emmett Cray arrived on the 5th day, in a good coat, off the Veyron barge, and he was the politest man who ever tried to end my trade. He had a hand in a velvet roll. He unwrapped it on my own bench and let Garrow pick it up, and it was beautiful work. Steel jaw, brass cam, a wrist that rotated through a quarter turn and locked at 4 positions, finished better than anything I have ever made. 12 silver, he said, delivered, fitted by any journeyman with an afternoon of instruction, guaranteed for 2 years and available on credit at 9 coppers a month against wages. Garrow held it for a long time. Then he put it down and asked whether the man wearing it could feel the bench under it. And Cray said that no device on earth could do that, and looked at me while he said it. He made his offer standing up, which is how a man makes an offer he expects to be taken. Buy the pattern outright. 200 silver for the drawings, the seat, the ring, and my hand in it as a paid instructor for 1 year, with the debt on my family's name settled on the day of signing. 200 silver against 7 owed. 60 days left on my sister's bond. A bench working in the open weather with 3 sets of tools between 8 people, and a guildmaster closing a door a month. I asked him who he worked for. He said he represented a surgeon of considerable standing who preferred that his interests not be advertised in a market town, and that the offer was the same whoever it came from. I told him no, and I told him in front of the bench, so that nobody there would have to wonder afterwards what I had done with a room full of holders in the yard behind me. He took it beautifully. He thanked me for my time, asked whether he might look at the work, and I said yes, because the work was standing in the open yard where anyone could see it. Then he spent 2 hours walking round my bench with a small book, and he wrote down the sockets, the ring, the screw, the cable run, the pad grades, our output for the week, and every one of our names. He asked Bram how long a fitting held before it wanted attention. Bram, who has never lied to anybody in his life, said he did not know yet, because nobody had worn one for a full year. Cray wrote that down too, and underlined it. And I watched him underline it and did not understand for another season what I had just let him carry on to that barge. 14 people held that bench by the end of the month, and between them they had 6 pounds of usable iron, which is 1 socket and a spare ring, and a cue outside that Mira had stopped reading aloud because it upset people. Al had nothing to sell me, not out of spite. The upstream stock had gone somewhere in bulk, and he had been told he would be served in the spring, and he told me the price of clean bar had moved twice in a fortnight without a single new order in his own book. Quill Bay came into the yard on a Tuesday, which he had never done, and stood looking at the bench for a while before he said anything, and then he told me his pier was going. 2 of the river piles had scoured out under the tide, and the whole crossframe had dropped 4 inches, and if it was not reset and pinned before the floodwater came down the valley, he would lose the pier, the wharf, and his contracts in 1 week. He had the timber. He had the pins. He had 11 loaders who had walked to the end of the plank, put a hand in that water, and walked back, because the melt was in the river, and a whole man loses his fingers in that cold inside 2 minutes. What he had that I wanted was metal. Bay's yard has an old iron store from the days when the dock ran its own barges, and it has been sitting there rusting gently while his father, and then he priced everything in tides instead. 50 measures of bar, I said. He said 30, and then he said 40, and then he said 50, and stopped looking at me like a man who knows what a flood costs, and Seth wrote it on the slate before either of us could improve on it. The corliss came before we had the tools out of the yard. That is the piece of it I think about. Not 1 coin, not 1 bar, not 1 nail had moved yet, and the bailiff was standing on Bay's wharf with a warrant in his hand. The Auric name carries a doubled assessment, as a repeat risk, he read out. And any work contracted by the marked bench where an auric holds a share is assessable at a fifth of its value before delivery, at the assessor's discretion. 10 measures of the 50. He said it pleasantly. Then he said, in the same pleasant voice, that a wise man would consider what such a pattern might be worth somewhere with no assessor in it at all. I told him the crew would decide the rate. Nolich no kage and so he decide not me, because I did not own the bench. He enjoyed that. He said it did not matter who owned what, as long as somebody was standing there when the fifth was due. So we priced his cut into the job, in front of him, out loud. Hala did the arithmetic on the wharf and set the crew rate at 50 measures, with 10 going to the assize, which meant Bay paid the fifth and the bench took 40. And Bay looked at Corliss the whole time she said it. Bay is not a sentimental man, and that was the first day I saw him properly angry. He asked Corliss whether the crown had come down to the water to help hold a pile, and Corliss said the crown does not get wet, which was the truest thing he ever said to me. The work took 4 days. I will not pretend it was clever. It was cold, it was slow, and it worked because of one thing nobody in that town had understood yet. A whole man in that water loses his hands in about 90 seconds. He does not let go because he is weak. He lets go because his fingers stop reporting, and a man who cannot feel a pin cannot hold a pin. An iron jaw closed on a shoulder cable does not care what the water is doing. Nib went in first, up to the chest with a rope on him and the cross-frame timber in his hook, and he held that timber for 11 minutes while Garrow set the pin. Bay's loaders stood on the wharf and watched marked men do the job they had refused, and one of them went and fetched hot water for the crew, unasked, 3 times, without ever once saying anything. Hitch tested the water on the second morning by falling into it, which he did chasing a gull off the cross frame, and came out of the river at the far pile with his wooden leg still strapped on and an expression of enormous personal grievance. Nib fished him out with the boat hook, and the crew stopped work over it for a good while, and Bay stood on his own wharf watching 8 marked people laugh at a dog in a flood tide and said nothing whatsoever about the time. That evening, Anakatol brought a pot of barley and mutton down to the wharf on her barrow and would not take coin for it, and priced it anyway out of habit, at 9 coppers, so that everybody would know what they were eating. Bram poured for the crew out of his pewter cup, one at a time, in the order of who had been in the water longest, and made a small ceremony of it that nobody had asked for and nobody objected to. On the 3rd day, the cable lock on Garrow's hook let go with a full pile brace in it, and he went into the river under 100 weight of wet oak. The cause had a name, salt and cold on a flesh seat. His anchor was one of the early ones, seated in the meat and not on the bone, and 4 days in brackish meltwater had swollen the whole arm inside the socket, until the ring no longer sat where I had put it. I was 50 feet away on the wharf with a drift punch in my hand, and I did not save him. I want that stated flatly, because there was a version of that afternoon I told myself for a while afterwards. Bram saved him. Bram had drilled that crew every morning for 9 days on one thing, which was that if a man goes in, the 2 nearest do not go in after him. They take the rope and the boat hook in a fixed order, and they do it counting out loud. They had him out in under a minute by that count. Seth broke 2 fingers on the boat hook and did not notice until the evening. Garrow's arm was crushed above the old cut. The socket ring had folded, and Naldi Sarah had him on a plank in Bay's grain shed inside the hour, and she told me what she was going to allow and what she was not. "You do not touch that arm today," she said. "The tissue is drowned and swollen, and if you clamp a ring on it now, you will kill the skin under it, and I will be taking his elbow in a fortnight." I said the flood was 2 days out, and that if he was not working, we were not finished, and Bay would lose the pier. She said she was aware of the flood, and it did not change what living tissue does under pressure. Then I asked her the real question, which was whether the deep seat could be set on bone that had already been crushed once, and she went quiet, and then she said she did not know, and that the honest answer was that nobody in the world knew. "He is going to want to work again," I said. She said that he would want it whether or not it killed him, and that wanting is not consent, and that if I set anything into that man, I would do it with him awake and hearing every word of what it might cost him. So we did it that way. Garrow lay on Bay's grain shed floor with a lamp on a barrel, and I told him the 3 things it could do, which were hold, fail, or take the arm, and Naldi stood there and made me say the last one twice. He said he had run a mill for 19 years and had never once let a shaft turn without knowing where his hands were, and that lying on a floor being decided about was worse than any of the three. Then he told me to get on with it before he thought about it any longer, and Naldi wrote in her own book that the patient had consented in front of a witness, because she is the most careful person I have ever worked beside. The deep seat is a different thing from the ring. The ring sits on the outside and finds the bone through the flesh. The deep seat goes down the load line itself into the place where the bone takes the weight, and it has to be held there by my own hand for as long as it takes. It took a little over 2 hours. I had my left hand around his arm the whole time, and the price for that is not sweat and it is not effort. And I had felt it coming since the night I sat on the workshop floor and counted 4 heartbeats. When I let go, the 2 outside fingers of my own left hand were dull. Not numb, not dead, dull. The way a hand feels through a thick glove, and they have been that way ever since. I did not tell anybody for 6 days. Naldi worked it out on the 2nd, because she watched me pick up a cup and correct for it, and she waited until we were alone, and then asked me what I had paid in exactly those words. Garrow came off that floor and worked the last day of the pier with his hand on a hot iron pin and reported the temperature of it back to me, laughing, which is not a sound I had heard out of him before. The pier held. It is still there. It held through that flood and the 2 after it, and Bay had his contracts and his wharf, and the whole valley knew inside a week who had gone into the water when the whole men would not. I told the crew about the reseating on the wharf, in front of everybody, before Bay's steward paid us, because it was the first time it had ever mattered enough to say out loud. Every anchor set in the field, in cold and wet, on a working arm, drifts, I said, not the grip. The grip is iron, and it will hold until the iron breaks. The feeling drifts over about a season, and it goes back to dead unless somebody who can tune it sets it again. Zeph asked how many somebodies there were in the world who could do that. I said 1, and the wharf went quiet, and Ren said from the back that this was a problem worth more attention than the pier had been. Bay's steward paid in iron on the wharf with the assize man standing there. 50 measures counted out, 10 measures onto Corliss's cart, 40 onto ours, and Hala wrote both columns. Mira came down to see 40 measures of bar iron arrive in the yard, and then said the thing nobody else in that crowd was going to say, which was that iron is not silver. 7 silver owed, she said. 31 days to the assize. That metal is a year of work, and it is not a coin. And if you take it to Hal and sell it, you have iron money and no iron, and the queue is still standing in the yard. I told her I knew. She said she was aware I knew, and that she was saying it in front of me so that I could not later decide she had been protected from it, which is a sentence she had clearly been saving up. Kestalile came up the bank while the bars were being counted. She runs the ferry crossing below the pier, and she had been watching the work for 4 days, and she had done her own arithmetic about it. Your new pier takes barges at the low tide now, she said, which means the grain that came off at my crossing and went up the road on carts comes off at Bay's Wharf instead, and that is 9 loads a week I used to carry. I asked her what she wanted me to do about it. She said nothing at all, that she was not asking for anything, and that she simply preferred the people who cost her a living to know her name when they had done it. Then she said, before she went back down to her boat, that the Ford Road was hers as well, and one day I would want it, and that she would remember this conversation on the day I did. Odo came in on the Ford Road that night, with his hand out for coin before he had his breath back, which is his invariable practice. The upstream iron is bought, he said. All of it, the Stonewick stock and the 2 yards above the falls, and not by a smith, a factor's man, paid on a Veyrun draft, buying anchor-grade bar in bulk and storing it, and the whole of it moving downriver by barge in nobody's name. I asked him who the factor was working for. He said that was the thing worth 2 coppers, and I gave him the 2 coppers, and he told me that nobody upriver would say the name out loud, which meant the buyer was somebody who paid well enough to be worth being afraid of. He fitted 6 off the queue in the 9 days that followed, working the bench in shifts around the dock nights, and the register in Mira's hand went from 14 names to 20. 20 fitted, 40 measures of iron in the yard, a pier standing, and 2 fingers of my own that could not tell me whether the bar I was holding was cold. Corwin Vale's quarter came up short by 19 silver, and the reason was written on the yard wall in Mira's own hand, because a man with a wage does not steal bread, and a man who does not steal bread never reaches the block. He posted his answer 11 days before the assize. An annual mark fee, 1 silver a year, payable by every man and woman in Ashmere carrying the sentence, on the grounds that the marked required additional oversight from the crown and ought to bear the cost of it. 62 people in that town carried the mark. He had found a way to be paid for the hands he had already taken, every year, forever. And Simro read it out in the market with his ears going red while he did it. The bench wanted to fight it as an argument. Seth wanted a petition. Nib wanted 11 of us to refuse to pay and see what he did, which would have got 11 people sentenced for default inside a month. Mira let all 3 of them finish, and then put her tally board and her register down on the bench between us and said we were arguing about the wrong document. She had been keeping it since the week Bram got his cup. Names, marks, the date each was fitted, what each person did now, and a third column nobody but her had thought was worth the ink, which was what each of them paid the town. 31 fitted by then, out of 40 measures of baize iron, and 11 weeks of shift work, and the other 29 names on that sheet were marked people with no fitting at all who had found work beside the ones who had. Market dues, wharf dues, stall rent, hearth tax, the wage rolls at Bay's dock and at the tannery, and the 2 Hala checked weights for. 41 names paying something every week they had not paid a year before. The whole answer is here, she said. He is going to stand in that hall and say the marked costs the crown money. Bring the marked and bring what they pay him, and make him say it in front of them. So we did not organize a protest, because a protest is a thing a court can have removed from a yard by 4 men with staves. We organized a queue. 60 of the 62 came. What a 60% is it came, which is a number I still find remarkable, since 2 of them were bedridden, and one of those sent his son with a note. They came in their working clothes, with their tools where the halls could see them being carried, and they stood in the yard outside the assize from before light. A queue that long, standing that long, in front of the building where every one of them lost a hand, does not stay calm on its own. It was going to break. I could see 3 or 4 men in it who were shaking before the doors opened. Bram fixed it without being asked. He walked down the line and started the drill, which is his own invention, and which he had never used on anybody but the crew. Set, close, hold, open, set, close, hold, open, at a count. He called out in a parade voice that had not been used in 19 years, and 60 people in a queue outside a court started working their hands in time with him. Half of them were not fitted, and did it anyway, with the hand they had left. An old woman near the back was doing it with a wooden spoon. Then Pitch got off his lead and went down the line for scraps at a dead run on 4 legs, 3 of them his own, and took a piece of bacon off a man who had lost his hand for stealing food, and that man laughed until he had to sit on the step. The whole queue went with him. 60 people who had been standing white and silent in front of a courthouse laughing at a dog, and the clerks came out to see what the noise was, and that was the shape the assize opened in. Vale read his fee to a hall he could not get everybody into. They filled the yard and the doorway and the windows, and he had to raise his voice, and a man who raises his voice in his own hall has already lost something. He put his case well enough. The marked required watching. Watching cost the crown. The crown was owed 1 silver a year from each of them, and the assize would begin collecting at this session, name by name, in the order on the sentence roll. I stood up when he reached the 3rd name and asked whether the crown wished to hear what the roll paid it already. He told me a marked man could not testify alone. I said I was not testifying. I was handing his clerk a document, and that if the crown did not want to read its own dues before it charged a fee, I would leave it on the table. Aaron Ash took the register. He is the assize scribe, and it is his office to enter documents put before the court, and Vale could not stop him doing his own job in front of 9 clerks without saying out loud that he did not want the numbers read. Perrin read the 3rd column, 41 names, what each paid weekly, and then he stopped in the middle of the 14th name and went back to the front of his own book instead, and asked the court's leave to read something else first. He had found it the night Vale posted the fee, and he had checked it twice, and he read it in the voice of a man who has been waiting 11 years to read 1 sentence aloud. The wording is 140 years old, and it governs assessment. No subject shall be twice assessed upon one cause. Where the assessment has been satisfied upon the body at the block, the cause is closed, and no further assessment shall lie against that subject upon it, provided he holds a trade. Provided he holds a trade. That was the hinge. And Vale had spent 7 weeks writing down in his own record that 60 of us held one. The hall did not understand it immediately. Perrin explained it once, I persuade Chernines while outsides plainly, and then he applied it to the case in front of him, which happened to be mine, because mine was the oldest open auric assessment in the book. The hand was the assessment. The fine on top of it was the second assessment on the same cause. The 4 silver I had paid in that room had been paid on a charge that could not stand. The 7 silver outstanding could not stand, and the doubled repeat mark rested on the same void assessment and fell with it. Struck for cause, Perrin said, and wrote it and read the entry back, and my sister's name came off the security line of that ledger in front of about 200 people. Mira did not cry, and she did not smile. She asked Perrin out loud whether the striking was entered under the same hand and date as the original, because an entry made loose can be lost, and Perrin said it was, and showed her, and she read it herself. Vale tried to take his fee back into the room. He said the striking touched one assessment, and not the fee, which was new, general, and lawfully posted, and he called the next name on the sentence roll. The name was a cooper called Hask, and Hask said, before Vale could get the sum out, that he had paid 2 coppers in market dues that Tuesday and 11 in hearth tax at midsummer. Then the man behind him said his figure. Then a woman in the doorway shouted hers, and then the market outside started, and it did not stop, because a crowd that has been quietly doing arithmetic for a year had finally been handed a reason to do it out loud. Vale's clerks could not tally against it. They tried for a while. You cannot write down 40 voices, and every one of those voices was a sum the crown had already collected from a person it was about to charge for existing. He came down off the silver before he withdrew it. Half a silver, he said, when the shouting thinned. Then 6 coppers, and then 6 coppers only from those in a trade, and the hall could hear him getting smaller with every offer. Hask asked him, from the floor, whether he would like to try 3 coppers, and the whole yard heard the crown's fine assessor haggling with a cooper about the price of a man's own hand. He withdrew the fee. He did it in the flattest voice I ever heard him use, and he did not say square, and he sat down before the noise stopped, which is the only mercy that Hall gave him. Hugh Corliss went down in the same session, and it had nothing whatever to do with me, which I have always thought was the best of it. Simro had brought a book of his own. Hugh Corliss had been selling assize dates to debtors, 4 coppers a name, a week's warning of when their case would be called so they could be out of town, and Roe had 11 of them written down with the dates and the sums. He had run it for 11 months out of Vale's own office, off Vale's own list, at a table 8 feet from where Vale sat, and read out other people's arithmetic. Vale dismissed him in the room, personally, in front of the clerks, and did it fast and hard, because the only thing standing between Corwin Vale and the same charge was how loudly he could disown the man who had carried his paperwork for 6 years. Corliss said one sentence on his way out. He said that everything he had ever done in that office had been done at a nod from the table, and Vale did not answer him, and the clerks wrote nothing down. His effects were seized and listed the same afternoon, because that is the procedure, and Perrin Ash read the list into the record item by item. The 4th item was an oak tool chest with a strapped lid, marked Auric, taken in assessment and never entered as sold. Perrin asked the court to restore it to the family, since it was listed against a dismissed officer and not against the crown, and the court had no reason on the record to refuse, and Vale sat there and let it go because he had nothing left to spend. Bram and Seth carried it back across the yard, every file, rasp, punch, drift, and clamp still in it, with my dead predecessor's mark stamped in the lid, and Mira opened it on the bench and went through it and made a list, because she makes a list of everything. Vale lost the seat itself before the sun went down, and it was not the fee that did it, and it was not his bailiff either. There had been a man sitting at the back of that hall all morning in a plain gray coat, with a clerk beside him and no title given, and when the session closed he stood up and walked to the table and told Vale that he would be taking the assize himself for the present. Crown Factor Ellis Marrow. He had been in Ashmere 4 days already, auditing why a quarter that had run at 90 silver for 6 years had come in at 71, and he had watched every minute of it. He was not angry with Vale. That is the thing about Marrow that took me too long to learn. He simply removed him, the way you take a bad blade off a good handle, and then he turned round and asked whose register it was. Mira said it was hers. He asked her to walk him through the 3rd column, and he read it standing at that table until the hall had emptied around him, and asked 4 questions, and every one of them was a good question. Then he asked the one I have thought about ever since. He asked how many more towns in this valley could produce a register like this one, and how quickly, and he was writing before she answered. I told him that depended on how many people could be trained to do the fitting. He said pleasantly that everything worth having depends on a number like that, and that he preferred to know it early. Odo came to the bench that night, having run from the Ford Road, and he did not ask for coin first, which is how I knew it was bad. He had been in the inn yard when Corliss came out with his effects, and Corliss had not been alone. Emmett Cray had been waiting for him with a purse and a room, and Odo had sat on the wall outside the window for an hour and a half. Corliss sold him everything: the bench, the holders, the register, the ring, the screw seat, the pier contract, the names of every person fitted and what each of them did, and then the piece Cray paid extra for at the end. That there is a tuning, Odo said, and that it is a thing only you can do, and that not one device in this town works the way people think it works without you putting your hand on it. Captain Delamard rode into the yard 11 days later with 4 troopers and a clerk, put a written order on my bench, and did not get down off her horse until I had read it. 100 fittings, hooks, cable hands, and whatever else worked for the maimed of the Ash Company, who were at that moment sitting in a barracks at Columns Ford, drawing half pay and eating full rations and being resented for both. The bottom of the order had a second clause in a different hand: the Ash Company to be the sole holder of the pattern within the kingdom, and the maker to fit no person outside the company's list for the term of 5 years. I asked her what she thought that clause was worth. She said 400 silver, which was what she was authorized to pay, and which was more coin than had passed through my hands in my entire life across 2 of them. Then she said the rest of it, because she is a straight dealer even when she is holding you by the throat. Without exclusivity, her paymasters would not sign, and if they did not sign, she would go to a surgeon in Veyrun who could supply 100 hands next month at 1/3 of my price. Then go to him, I said, and I said it in front of her clerk, and I went back to filing a socket edge while she sat there. She had not expected that, and she did the thing I have since watched a great many capable people do in that yard, which is to stop treating a marked man as an item on a list and start doing arithmetic about him instead. I told her the terms she could have: 100 fittings, no exclusivity, half the sum in advance, half on the day the last man was fitted, plus a service fee each season afterwards for reseating, paid whether or not she thought she needed it. She asked what the service fee bought that the fitting did not. I told her she was not buying 100 limbs. She was buying a standing arrangement with a bench, and that the difference would arrive in about a season whether she had signed for it or not. Nib, who has no patience and less tact, said from behind the anvil that if she wanted 100 dead hands cheap, there was a man in Veyrun selling them, and if she wanted 100 men who could tell hot from cold in the dark, there was one bench in the world doing it, and she was standing in it. She paid half in advance: 200 silver, of which 120 came as requisitioned iron off the company's own stores, which is how I learned that an army can simply take metal at a price the seller does not get to argue about. Marrow let the contract stand. He was 2 weeks into holding the assize, and Payne's notice was still nailed to the board. And when Perrin Ash asked him plainly whether the sale of 100 fittings to the Crown's own company fell under it, Marrow said the Crown does not fine itself, and went back to his ledger. I should have thought harder about a man who leaves a law standing and simply steps over it when it suits him. At the time, I was looking at 200 silver and a queue. I remember that whole season as a noise rather than as a run of days, and Mira has the dates written down because I could not tell you one of them now. Haldun doubled his forge on the strength of Mard's advance. 2 more hearths, a second striker, his sister's boy on the bellows, and a price list he read out to me every fortnight with visible pleasure, since he was now selling to the only customer in the valley who could not go anywhere else. I asked him once whether he ever intended to charge me a fair price. He said he had been charging me a fair price the whole time, and that fair means what a thing is worth to the man who needs it, and that he would put that on his gate if he could spell it. Then he took 1/3 of the Mard advance as his share of the first 3 fittings under our old slate agreement, which strictly speaking had been settled 2 seasons before, and I paid it, because a bargain struck in front of an apprentice is a bargain. Odo ran the routes: Columns Ford and back in a day, the Ford Road, the Roofway, the barge schedule in his head, and by midsummer he was charging me a copper a mile and worth twice that. Mira ran 4 columns, names fitted, iron in and out, coin in and out, and days remaining on the company contract. And she hired 2 girls off the market to keep the tallies because her own days had stopped having room in them. She asked me for a wage at the end of the first month. Not a share, not keep, a wage. Stated in coppers a week, with the sum written on the same sheet as everybody else's. I said she was my sister. She said that was exactly the difficulty, that every person in that yard could point at a line with their name and a number on it except her, and that she was not going to spend her life as somebody's household. 6 coppers a week in her own name, entered by Hala and not by me. She has never once let me pay her late. We fitted the rest of Ashmere that season as well, because it turned out that once 31 people in a town of 4,000 can pick things up, the remaining marked stop being invisible and start being asked. 60 in Ashmere, 100 for the company, and somewhere around the 70th or 80th, the thing I had been calling sleeplessness stopped being possible to call that. It had been there since the pier, and I had been lying to myself about it, in the way a man does about his own body. A pressure behind the breastbone all the time that came up when the day started and eased at night. It is the load. Every limb I have ever tuned, working all at once, arriving as one weight with no names in it. At 12, it was nothing. At 60, it was a hum I could work through. At 160, it woke me at the 4th hour every morning and put me on the workshop step in the dark. I could tell you how hard the kingdom's fitted men were working on any given morning. I could not tell you one name, one town, one reason, or whether any of them were in trouble, and I have never in my life wanted a piece of information more than I wanted the names. The first jolt came in the 11th week. One clean tearing drop, like a step missed in the dark, and then the weight was 1 unit lighter and stayed lighter. Somewhere a limb had broken, or a man wearing one had died, and I sat on that step with my heart going and no way on earth to know which. And Odo did not come in with the answer for 9 days, because Columns Ford is a day away, and news does not travel faster than a boy on a road. It was a broken limb. A trooper called Ems had put his hook under a cart axle to lift it, which no hook in the world will take, and the jaw had come off at the cam. 9 days between the jolt and the answer. I spent every hour of them inventing funerals for people who turned out to be at supper, and then I went back to the bench. The night before the last delivery wagon left, the bench ate together in the yard, which we had not done since the pier. Annika Toll did the cooking and priced every dish out loud as she set it down, which is her way of saying you are welcome. Marek Dow the tanner sent a hide for the sockets and stayed for the pork, and near the end of the evening he asked me very carefully whether a boy of 9 could be fitted, and I told him not yet, and told him why, and promised I would come and find him when it changed. I'd seek and see and all be SR. Had already tried it 3 weeks before on a boy of 12 off the North Bank, and I had taken the fitting back off his arm inside the month, and I had not told anybody in that yard about it. A boy grows. The seat is set to a bone that is going to be a different bone in 8 months, and every anchor I know how to build is fixed. And a fixed seat on a growing arm goes from feeling to pressure to a sore that will not close. I sat in Naldi's sick room afterwards, and she let me finish explaining before she said the obvious thing, which was that I had built the best hand in the kingdom and could not put it on the people who had the most years left to wear it. So Merrick got not yet, and I went and looked at the drawings again that night, and every road out of that problem went through metal that could be let out as a body grew, and there is no such metal in this valley. Bram stood up at the end of it with his cup and did not make a speech, because he does not make speeches. He set a drill instead. 4 positions, he said. Set the seat, draw the cable, close on nothing, close on the cup. And then he said that from the following week, he would be running that drill twice a day on any person who wanted to learn to fit another person, and not on me, because I was one man, and one man is a bad plan. Nobody at that table had a word for what he had just started. It was not a school, and it was not a trade, and it certainly was not licensed, and 11 people put their hands up anyway. Pitch took the pork off the table during the count, and got out of the yard with it before anybody had stood up, and Bram said, without turning round, that the dog had better drill than half of them. The 100 were delivered and fitted at Columns Ford across 9 days in the 8th month of that year, in a barracks yard, with Naldi there for the 2 that needed a bone setter, and Garrow running the second bench. Then Captain Delamard refused to pay the second half of the money, and she did not do it by letter. She did it in person, standing up in her own barracks yard, which I will give her credit for, and she gave me a reason rather than an excuse. The company had been billed for 100 limbs. The limbs were on her men's arms. There was nothing left for her to buy. I asked about the service. She said she had 100 working hands and a paymaster who would not sign for a fee to maintain something that was already working, and that if I wanted to argue, she would hear me in Veyrun in the spring. Seth wanted to go back with a wagon and take them off the men. Nib wanted the law, which made everybody laugh in a way that hurt. I did nothing. That is the entire tactic, and it took me 3 days to see it, and it is the only weapon I have ever used that cost me nothing and left no mark on anybody. The season turned. Nobody from my bench went to Columns Ford because nobody had been paid to go to Columns Ford, and 100 anchors set in a barracks yard in the 8th month came due for reseating in the 1st month of the next year. They drifted exactly as I had said they would on Bay's Wharf with the whole crew listening. The men stopped being able to feel anything through the iron, one at a time, over about 5 weeks, and every hand gripped perfectly the whole way down. Mard's own sergeant came to Ashmere first, on his own horse and his own time, and he did not come with a demand. He came and stood in the yard and said that he had got used to knowing when his horse was warm, and he would like it back, and asked what it cost. 22 of them came in that month on their own. I reseated everyone and charged them nothing, because none of them had signed anything, and because a man who has had a thing taken away twice does not need me to make a point of it. Mard arrived in the 5th week. She did not apologize, which I had known she would not, and she did not pretend she had misunderstood the terms. I was wrong about what I had bought, she said, standing in the middle of my yard with her own men watching. I thought I was buying iron. Name the arrangement, and I will keep it. She could not pay coin. Her paymasters had closed the account when the 100 were delivered, and she was not going back to Veyrun to explain that she needed money for hands the crown already owned. So she paid in what she actually controlled. Escort for my wagons on the Columns Ford Road and the North Bank, standing whenever the bench asked. Road access through her posts, her company's forge for anchor work at cost. Wren asked her in front of everybody whether any of that would be in writing. Mard said no. She said her paymasters would never sign it, that it was her word and her company's practice, and that it would hold as long as she held the company. I took it. 60 in Ashmere, and 16 Hashmi, 100 at Columns Ford, 22 reseated for nothing, and the only thing standing between my wagons and the Ford Road was one officer's promise that no clerk in the kingdom had ever seen. Master Surgeon Aldous Rhyme came up from Veyrun on his own barge in the 1st week of the new year, and the first thing he did in Ashmere was buy every one of my crew a hot dinner. He did not ask my permission, and he did not do it behind my back. He walked into the yard, shook Bram's iron hand, told Hala her scale was out by a grain, and put an open account at the inn for anybody who worked at that bench. Then he asked whether he might borrow my anvil for a while, and he laid out a limb on my own bench in front of my own people. It was better than mine. I am going to say that once, plainly, because the men who tell you their rival's work is rubbish are the men who get beaten by it. Forged steel jaw, a ratchet that held 4 grades of grip without the shoulder holding anything, a wrist that turned and locked, a socket lined in boiled leather over a cork bed, and a weight that came in under 2/3 of my cable hand. He had Garrow test it, which was the right choice, since Garrow is the one person in that yard who will tell a rich man his work is poor. Garrow put it on over his own socket and lifted the anvil stone with it twice, and then set it down and said out loud that it was the best mechanical hand he had ever had on his arm. Rhyme thanked him for it as though the compliment were a payment. He said his yard turned out 60 a month in Veyrun, that they held for 4 years without a smith touching them, and that he could put one on every marked person in this valley by autumn on a payment of 9 coppers a month. Then he made his offer, and he made it to me in front of all of them, standing where they could all hear it, because he had understood inside an hour that my bench was not a place where things get decided privately. Your tuning, he said, my supply, my forge, my capital, and the crown's contracts. You would never buy iron again, never argue with a guildmaster again, and never again decide which one of 11 people waiting in a yard gets the only socket you can build this week. He offered me 1/3 of the whole trade in writing, a house in Veyrun, and the immediate settlement of any obligations standing against my name or my sister's anywhere in the kingdom. I asked him what he wanted for it. He said the tuning, and the tuning only, and that he would fund a school for it, and that this was the most generous offer either of us would ever hear in our lives, and he was not exaggerating. Then Nib asked him where his hands came from, because Nib does not know how to leave a room comfortable. Rhyme answered him completely, and answered him standing up. He is not ashamed, he is not hiding, and he had that answer polished and ready because he had given it in better rooms than mine. Some of them are the sentenced, he said. Some of them are the injured, and some of them are men who came to me and asked to make an arrangement, because a hand is worth a great deal to a man with debts and nothing else to sell. He said that word the way other men say a sum, an arrangement. He must have used it 9 times that afternoon, and every one of them meant a right hand off a living arm on a table in Veyrun with the client's consent and a purse counted out beside it. He had brought 2 of those men with him on the barge, at his own cost, which tells you how carefully that afternoon had been packed. The first was a wool factor called Petrin, who had sold his hand for 40 silver, cleared his debts, kept his warehouse and his family, and who wore one of Rhyme's steel hands and used it to shake mine. He was not a broken man, and he was not a fool, and he did not want my pity. He told the yard he had made a straight bargain with his eyes open, that he had bought 11 years of his own life with it, and that the only people who thought badly of it were people who had never been 8 days from losing everything. The second was a young man of about 20, who said less and smiled more, and who told me the ratchet was the finest thing he had ever owned, and who had a debt paper on him. Because that is the second half of it. Every limb Rhyme issues goes out against an indenture, written to him personally, not to the crown and not to a company. The device is his, the debt is against the device, and the wearer pays 9 coppers a month for the term, or works it off in his yards. Naldi Sarah had come to see the demonstration, and she stayed for the offer, and Rhyme turned to her before he turned back to me, because he had done his reading on this town. He offered her a hospital, 12 beds, clean water piped from the mill leat, a stove, an assistant, a stipend paid quarterly and drawn on Veyrun, and a supply of the one thing she has never had in her life, which is time. She stood there for a while. I have never seen Naldi hesitate before or since, and I do not intend to be the man who pretends she did not hesitate then. Then she said no, and she said why, in the flat voice she uses for splinting. She said that a woman who takes a stove from a man who cuts healthy hands off living people will spend the rest of her life explaining that she did not know what he was, and she does know what he is. Then she said the other half out loud, which is what makes her who she is. She would lose 4 or 5 patients this year to infection that a stove and clean water would have prevented. She knew their names and their streets, she said, and she was choosing to lose them, and I was not to say one word to comfort her about it. Rhyme took the refusal without a flicker. He said he hoped she would reconsider by the spring, and that the offer would stand, and it was still standing 3 years later, which is the thing about him. Before he turned back to me, Seth asked the question the whole bench had been carrying since the anvil stone went up, which was whether the work they did in that yard was simply worse. It is a fair question, and it deserved better than a speech, so I asked Petrin whether he would help me with something, and I asked Rhyme's leave first, and Rhyme gave it with both hands because he thought he knew how it would go. Put a cloth over 4 things on the bench: a wet stone, a dry stone, a cup of water off the fire, and a cup out of the trough, all 4 the same shape, and I asked Petrin to put his steel hand under the cloth and tell the yard which was which. He tried. He is a decent man, and he did not perform, and he got the shapes right and the weights right, and on the 4th one he said, honestly, that he could not tell me a thing about any of them beyond that they were there. Then Bram went under the cloth with the same 4. Wet, he said. Dry. That one is off the fire, and it is not hot enough to burn. That one has been in the trough since morning, and there is grit on the bottom of it. Nobody in the yard said anything, which is the only sound that has ever meant anything in this trade. Petrin stood looking at the cloth for a while, and then he asked Bram, quite quietly, what the water actually felt like, and Bram told him, and Petrin nodded and did not ask anything else. Rhyme watched all of it with genuine interest and not one flicker of doubt. He said afterwards that it was a fine demonstration and that he would fund the research to close the gap, and I understood then that he could not hear what had just happened, because he has never once felt it and cannot. Then he turned back and waited for my answer, with the whole bench standing round the anvil and his own barge crew in the gateway. I refused him in front of the bench, standing between Bram and Garrow, and I made myself say the whole reason so that nobody in that yard could ever tell themselves I had turned down a house in Veyron out of pride. Your hands work, I told him. They work better than mine, and every person here has just watched them work. But a hand you rent to a man against a paper you hold is not a hand. It is a lease. And the day he cannot pay you, it comes off his arm and goes onto another man. He said that no device of his had ever been repossessed. I said that was because no client of his had ever been 11 months in arrears yet, and that we were both in a trade where the interesting number arrives late. Then I said the piece I had thought about since Columns Ford, which was that I was not selling the tuning because the tuning is the only thing in this arrangement that cannot be taken from the people wearing it, and I intended to keep it exactly that inconvenient. He smiled at that, genuinely, the way a man does at a decent move on a board. He said that he would remember the phrasing, and that he had expected this answer and would have thought less of me for any other one. And then he did not threaten me. He did not raise his voice. He did not warn me. He thanked the crew for their time, and he went back down to his barge, and everybody at that bench slept well that night, including me. The price of anchor-grade iron moved 11 days after his barge went downriver, and it did not stop moving for a month. Anchor-grade bar had stood at 6 coppers the pound in Hal Dunn's yard for 2 years. It went to 9, then to 17, then to 22, and then to 42 coppers the pound inside a month, which is 7 times what I had been paying while Rhyme was eating my crew's dinner. The Stonewick yard would not sell to Hal at all. The 2 upstream stocks above the falls were both under a standing contract to a Veyron buyer, one of them for 3 years, signed the week before Rhyme ever set foot in Ashmere. Hal came into the yard with the letters in his hand and read them out. He is not a man who complains, and he did not complain. He said his forge had 4 hearths now, 2 of them built on my orders, and that at 42 coppers the pound he could not make me a single anchor that anybody in this valley could afford. Then he told me the rest of it, because he is honest even when it costs him. He had been offered a supply, anchor grade bar, delivered monthly at 31 coppers on a 2-year contract, from a factor in Veyron who had approached him the same week. Wren was at the bench, and she asked him one question, which was whether any of the sample bar was in the yard. There were 2 lengths of it in the corner. She went out and put her fingers on them, and she stood there for a while with her head turned away in the way she does when she is reading something, and then she told us what was stamped into the flat of the bar under the rust. Maker's stamp, 3 strokes and a crossbar in a lozenge, Rhyme's own yard mark. The same mark she had felt on the wrist plate of the steel hand Garrow tested, which she had run her thumb over that afternoon out of habit and had not mentioned to anybody. He had bought the Valley's iron and was selling it back to my own smith at 5 times the old price, under his own stamp, with a 2-year contract that would have tied Hal to him past the end of everything. Wren learned that stamp by heart. She sat on the bench with the bar across her knees and ran her fingers over it for the better part of an hour, the way she reads a growth ring. And then she said she would know it now on anything, anywhere, in the dark. That came to matter a great deal, on a road none of us had any reason to think about yet, and I did not understand what she had just done. What it did that afternoon was smaller, and I have always liked it better. There were 2 other smiths waiting in Hal's yard, one from Stonewick and one from the Ford, both there to ask the same question about the same price. Wren showed them the stamp. She put their fingers on it, which is a thing nobody does to a smith, and she told them where else she had felt it, and she was believed because she was standing in Hal Dunn's forge, and Hal Dunn did not contradict her. The Stonewick man refused his delivery on the spot. He walked out to the factor's agent in the lane and canceled a standing order in front of 6 people and said, loudly enough for the whole yard, that he would not buy his own scarcity from the man who made it. One size smith out of the hundreds Rhyme supplies. I know exactly what that is worth. It is the first time anybody had ever refused that man in public, and it happened in a muddy forge yard in a market town, and it happened because a marked woman can read a stamp with her fingers. Hal did not sign the contract either. He told me straight that he might have to before winter, and that if it came to his forge or my anchors, I should understand which way he would go, and I told him I did understand, and that I would rather hear it now than find out in the spring. The summons came 4 days after that, downriver, in a leather case, with the crown seal on it and Ellis Marrow's name under the seal. I was required to attend the Crown's Hall at Veyrun on the first sitting of the second month, to advise on a matter of trade and revenue, and to bring my register and any person who kept it. We went up by the road because the barge would have cost 4 silver for 3 people, and Mira had already decided what those 4 silver were for. Halfway through the second day, a courier's cart came off the Crown Road ahead of us with a cracked hub, and the driver was standing in the ruts, swearing at a wheel he could not lift and a mailbag he could not leave. Garrow and I got the axle up on stones. The hub had spread rather than split, which you cannot see and can feel, and I put my hand on it and found the high side and told him where to drive the wedge. Hindi I zal onin I by dollar. It took about a quarter of an hour. He offered me 6 coppers and I told him to keep it, mostly because I wanted to be in Veyrun before dark and not because I am a good man. He wanted my name for the ledger of his run. I gave him Nevin Oric, and he looked at my hand and then at the wheel. And then he said he would be telling that in 3 post houses between here and the coast, and by every account that reached me later, he did. Veyrun is 2 days upriver and about 400 years further along. The Crown's Hall has a floor of green stone and a gallery for men who are there to be seen listening, and Aldous Rhyme was already sitting in it when we were shown in. Ellis Marrow did not waste a minute of anybody's time. He put the model on the table in front of me the way a decent smith puts out his work, and he explained it to a marked man in a market coat as carefully as he would have explained it to a duke. The hand list is to be widened, poaching added outright, and debt brought down from a judge default to any 4 silver standing unpaid at the quarter, effective at the spring assizes across the valley towns. Every person so sentenced is to be issued a limb, not sold, issued at the Crown's arrangement with a single supplier against the wearer's personal indenture, at 9 coppers a month, and the sentenced works in a crown yard or a contracted yard until the indenture is clear. The Crown pays nothing. The supplier takes the paper, the treasury takes the fine, the fee and the labor, and the man on the road at the end of it is fed and working and mended, and owes his mending to the man who took the hand. I have never heard anything so bad explained so well. He had the figures for 4 towns, he had the yields, he had the projected saving on parish relief, and every single number in it was true. Then he offered me the tuning contract for the kingdom. 1,500 silver a year, a house, a hall license for my bench, a wage in my sister's name on the Crown's own roll, and the standing of a crown craftsman for a man who cannot legally swear an oath. One condition, and he stated it plainly, because he is not ashamed of it either. Tuning would be a grant, not a service. The compliant would be tuned. The idle, the resistant, and the runaway would keep the iron and lose the feeling, and it would be my hand that decided which. Rhyme spoke once in the whole session, from the gallery, and said that it was an elegant arrangement, and that he was content to supply the mechanical piece of it. I asked Marrow one question first, and I asked it for the clerks rather than for me. I asked what happens to a man who has worn the Crown's issued hand for 4 years, and still cannot clear 9 coppers a month. He gay answered without consulting anything. The indenture continues, he said. The device is maintained, the man is fed and housed in the contracted yard, and the obligation runs until it is satisfied or until he dies. It does not descend to his children, he added, and he said that piece as though it were the mercy in it, and by his own lights it was. So the sentence ends and the debt does not, I said, and he agreed with me pleasantly, and one of the treasury men wrote something down. I said no, while Marrow was still describing the house, which was rude, and which I would do again in the same order. I did not deliberate, and I did not thank him for the offer, and I have thought since about whether a better man would have played that room longer, and I do not think a better man would have. I told him that a fitting is not a reward, that I had never once put one on a person as payment for behavior, and would not start with the Crown's list, and that the day feeling becomes a thing granted to the obedient, it stops being feeling and becomes a leash. Clerks wrote it down. 2 of the treasury men looked at Marrow, Mira standing behind me with the register under her arm, and no standing whatsoever in that hall, did not move a muscle. Marrow was not angry. He said that he had asked in good faith and been answered in good faith, and that the crown would proceed on the other footing, and he called the next item on his own list without a pause. What I was doing while he spoke was counting doors. A man who has been refused a license in a market town learns to listen to a ruling for the shape of the hole in it, and I was already asking myself what exactly the crown would find itself forbidding. The other footing arrived before the session closed, and it was better built than anything I had prepared for on that road. The tuning of a fitted limb is declared a licensed trade under the crown on the grounds of public safety, since an unlicensed hand upon a mended man is a hazard. The license is to issue from the halls on hall membership at the guild master's recommendation. A marked man cannot hold hall membership. That is the statute. It is the oldest wording in it, and it has never been changed, and it did not need to be changed that day because it was already doing the work. So the thing only I could do had become a thing only somebody else was permitted to do. Marrow did not smile when the clerk read it. He wrote a note in his own book and moved on, and I understood that I was not the subject of that afternoon. I was an item in it. Rhyme found me in the outer corridor afterwards and said one sentence, and it was not gloating. He said the offer of a partnership remained open and would remain open, and that he could wait longer than I could, and then he went back in to finish his own business. We went home on the barge because Mira said the 4 silver had just become the cheapest money we would ever spend, and she wanted 2 days of nobody talking to her. She did not speak to me until the town was out of sight behind us, and then she came and stood in front of me and said it, because she had decided on that road that she was not going to be a person who thought things about her own brother and kept them. You should have taken it, she said. 1,500 a year, a place on the crown's roll with my own name on it, a license for the bench, and 60 people in Ashmere who could be fitted lawfully by somebody other than you. I told her what the condition was. She said she had heard the condition, she had been standing 4 feet behind me, and that she had also heard him say the compliant would be tuned, which meant that on the worst day of it, some men would be tuned, and on the best day of it, all of them would. What she said next, I have still not answered. She said that a man who refuses on principle in a hall in Veyrun goes home to a bench, and a man who refuses on principle in Ashmere goes to the block, and that I had made a decision on behalf of everyone in that yard without asking one of them. I said I would have made the same decision if they had voted. She said she knew, and that this was exactly what she was complaining about, and then she sat down beside me anyway, and stayed there for the rest of the afternoon. She had asked a clerk for a copy of the Crown's own projection while I was being licensed out of my trade, and he had handed it over because she is a girl with a ledger under her arm, and nobody in that building looked at her twice. She worked on it for most of the first day on the water. Then she came and sat down next to me on the coil of rope at the stern and told me not to say anything until she had finished. They have spent it, she said. The projection runs 11 years. The Treasury has already drawn against the first 3 of them, on paper, for the roadworks and the coast garrison, and the sums are entered as receipts. I asked her what happens if the model does not pay. She said the model pays as long as the sentenced keep working and keep owing, and it pays nothing at all the moment the wearers stop being in debt. They have built 3 years of spending, she said, on the assumption that a great many maimed men stay maimed men who owe money. She told nobody else, not Wren, not Bram, not Perrin Ash. And when I asked her why she said that, a number like that is worth nothing until there is a room in which to say it, and that we did not have the room yet. Odo met us at the Ford Landing at the end of the 2nd day, and he had been running for 3 days, and he had a tally stick with him, which he had never bothered with before. The criers had gone out with the widened list on the same morning we left the hall, not in the spring. Immediately, at every market between Veyrun and Ashmere, and Odo had walked or run through 6 of them counting. 19 sentenced at Larrow in 4 days, 11 at Stonewick, 4 at Columns Ford, and 9 on the North Bank. Debt mostly. 2 for short-weight, 1 old woman for a poached hare. I want to be exact about what I knew and how I knew it, because this is where it starts to matter. I did not feel any of that. Not one of them was wearing anything I had built, so the load in my chest did not move by a hair while 43 people lost their right hands in a week. Gift tells me how many and how hard and nothing else, and it had never once been so completely useless as it was on that landing, while a 14-year-old boy read me a tally stick. Simro read the list in Ashmere Market the morning we got back. He read it twice because that is the rule, and his voice was steady and his hands were not, and Mira was watching him rather than the crowd. 4 silver of debt. There is not a family on the river that does not carry 4 silver of debt in a bad winter. The queue formed in our own blockyard 9 days later, in the same place we had queued for Vale's fee, and it was not for us. Imes agents were in Ashmere before the ink dried, with a wagon, a clerk, and a table, and they set up 11 paces from my bench, because the blockyard is crown ground and open to anyone, which I had been rather pleased about once. 9 coppers a month, a steel hand in a week, no fitting fee, no assize charge, and a paper to sign. 41 people signed in 3 days, and most of them had been sentenced 11 days earlier. I stood at my own bench and watched a man I had fitted 6 months before help a man he had known all his life onto the other wagon, because I could not legally put a hand on that man's arm, and Rhyme could. A carter called Weld came to my bench on the 2nd day of it, with his arm 4 days healed, and his wife holding the wrap, because he had asked at the wagon what the difference was, and somebody had told him honestly. He wanted the one that feels. He had been sentenced for 6 silver of debt on a load he lost in the flood, and he stood in front of my anvil and asked me to do it and said he would work the 30 days, and the bench could have anything he owned. I told him I could not, and I told him why, and I told him what the paper at the other table would cost him over 11 years, and then I watched him think about it and go and sign it anyway, because his wife was holding the wrap and the wagon had a hand in a box. He apologized to me. That is the thing I could not put down for weeks afterwards. A man who had just lost his right hand for 6 silver stood in the blockyard and apologized to me for taking the only offer he had. Bram asked me that evening what the crew was to do, and I did not have anything to give him, and Seth asked whether the holding still meant anything, and Ren answered before I could and said that it meant exactly as much as it had meant last week, which was that we owned a bench. Garrow said the practical thing, in the flat way he says everything, that the iron in the yard would build 11 anchors, that we could not lawfully fit any of them to anybody, and that the anchors would keep. That night, I sat on the step with the load in my chest, going quietly on about 180 working limbs, and did the only arithmetic that mattered. Every hand I had made better had made a hand worth more to take. Marrow had not widened that list because my trade failed. He had widened it because my trade worked, and a maimed man who can be mended is worth more to a treasury than a maimed man who cannot. I had spent 2 years proving that the marked could be put back to work, and the Crown had read my sister's register and drawn the obvious conclusion, which was to make more of them. Perrin Ash came into the yard on the 4th morning with the Crown's licensing order in one hand and a hall charter from the year of the old king in the other, and asked me to gather everybody who could stop working long enough to hear him out. He read the Crown's own wording aloud first, twice, the way Simro reads a list, so that nobody could later claim to have misheard it. No person shall fit, tune, seat, or maintain a mended limb for hire, gift, or trade without a license of the halls. Every verb in that sentence is a thing done to a wearer. There is no wearer in a lesson, Perrin said. The order binds the fitting. It does not bind the teaching of a fitter, because the men who drafted it did not imagine that anybody but you could be taught. Bram asked whether a man who had been taught by me could then lawfully fit somebody. Perrin said no, and said it flatly, and did not dress it up. Then he said the second half of it. A hall member with a license may fit. A trained tuner may not. Nobody at all is forbidden to learn. The day the halls have to stand up and explain why they will not license people who can do the work better than their own members, he said, that argument happens on our ground, and not on theirs. Ren put her hand flat on the bench and said she wanted it in that order. Learn first, argue after, and never ask permission for the piece that is already lawful. The physical consequence arrived inside the hour, because Bram set the drill up in the yard, where the Crown's own wagon table could see it, and started teaching 4 people to seat a socket in the open air 11 paces from Rhyme's clerk. I took 4 students, Ren, Bram, Odo, and Garrow, and I chose them for 4 different reasons, and got 3 of them wrong. I am a bad teacher. It took a month and 2 ruined sockets before anybody in that yard was willing to tell me so. Trouble is that I do it by feel, and I had never once had to say what my hands were doing. Set the seat, I would say, and they would ask where, and I would say where it goes, and Garrow would put his tools down and look at the ceiling. Bram fixed it the way he fixes everything. He made me do it slowly, out loud, in 4 numbered positions, and he wrote each position down in his own hand on a board. And when I skipped a step, he made me start again in front of everybody like a recruit. The 2 ruined sockets were mine and Odo's, in that order. Mine went wrong because I shaped it while explaining and put the ring a full finger high, which is the sort of thing that happens to a man doing 2 jobs badly at once. Odo's went wrong because he had watched me put mine on high and copied it exactly, and then defended it at length on the grounds that this was how I did it, which is the most expensive sentence a teacher ever hears. Ren learned the seat in 9 days. Odo learned the socket in 11 and the cable in 3, because a boy who has never had a right hand has thought about how one works more than any of us. Garrow was the slowest and the best. He kept asking why, which I could not answer, and every time I could not answer, he built a jig so that the question stopped mattering. Then Ren ignored me, deliberately, for 6 days, and did not mention it until she had something to put on the bench. I had been teaching the seat as I built it, which is to shape the ring to the bone and lock it with the screw. She said the screw was the reason a seat drifted, because a screw is a fixed answer to an arm that changes across a day of work. She built hers with a leaf of spring steel behind the pad. It rides the arm, it takes up the swelling of a working morning and gives it back in the evening, and it holds pressure without holding position. I told her it would not hold a deep seat. She fitted it to Hala, who works a scale 11 hours a day and whose arm swells more than anybody's, and Hala wore it for 9 days and reported that it had not moved once and that she wanted it kept. That leaf is in every socket we build now. Ren named it herself in front of the bench as the spring seat, and she looked at me while she named it, and I said out loud that it was hers and better than mine. I have never said that about a student's work since, because I have not needed to. They stopped asking me whether their improvements were allowed somewhere around the 2nd month. The deep seat was the thing I could not teach by talking, and I knew it, and I put it off for 3 weeks. Nib had settled it for me by then anyway. His anchor was one of the early ring seats, and he had taken a bad fall off a wagon at midwinter, and the arm had healed crooked round the seat, and the feeling had been going out of it for a month. He asked for the deep one. He asked in front of the bench. He heard the price twice, once from me and once from Naldi, and he said that he had spent 4 years being handled, and he would decide what happened to his own arm. Mira objected out loud, in the yard, in front of the 4 students and Naldi and Nib himself, which she had never once done to me in public before. She said the sums, 2 fingers of my left hand after Garrow at the pier, gone and not coming back. 4 students who were not ready to take that work off me. 180 limbs in the kingdom depending on one man's hands, and one man's hands being spent, in public, as a lesson. Teach them the seat with words, she said. You have never once found a way to make a thing cost less by paying more of it first. I told her the words did not exist yet, and that the only way to make the seat teachable was to have 4 people watching hands that already knew how, while there were still hands that knew how. She said that was an argument for doing it and not an answer to her, and she was right, and I did it anyway with her standing there. 2 hours and 11 minutes on Nib's arm in the middle of the yard, with 4 people leaning over me and Naldi calling the time. I talked the whole way through it, which I have never done before, and Bram wrote down what I said in fragments that made no sense to anybody but the 4 of them. When I let go, the palm of my left hand had stopped reading surfaces. Pressure is still there, heat is still there, but wood and iron and cloth are one thing to that palm now, and I have to look to know what I am holding. I did not tell Mira for 2 days. She found out because I picked up a hot pan by the rim and did not know until I smelled it, and she stood in the doorway and did not say a single word, and that was worse than the yard had been. Naldi stayed in the yard after the students had gone and said that she had now watched the deep seat done twice, at the pier and here, on 2 men, with 2 different causes, and that both of them were still alive and working. Then she said the thing she has never taken back, that she would stand behind the method in front of anybody, in any room in the valley, on the condition that she was present for every deep seat done in this town from that day forward, and that nobody did one on a person she had not examined first. I asked her whether that was an endorsement or a leash. She said it was both, that she had been offered a hospital by a man who did not want either of those conditions attached to anything, and that I could take her terms or I could work without a bone setter. Nib had the feeling back in his arm inside a day and went back to rope. Ren wrote the 4 positions of the deep seat out fair on a board from Bram's fragments and her own hands, and that board is the reason there are tuners in 3 towns now. Garrow made the first fitting that nobody watched, and I did not find out about it until it was already 3 hours over. He did it on a Thursday in the Tanner Street, on Marek Dow's own brother, while I was at the bench arguing with Hal about the price of pig iron and did not know it was happening. Came back and told me afterwards, and he told me in the way a man reports rather than the way a man confesses, and the difference was the whole point. Socket, cable, spring seat, and the shallow tune, he said. It took him 4 hours because he checked everything twice. The man felt the door latch under his hand while Garrow was still packing up his tools. I asked him whether he had told the wearer the price and the law. He said he had told him both, twice, and had made him say it back, because that is what I do, and he had been watching me do it for 2 years. It held. It is still holding. There is a man in Ashmere who has feeling in his right hand and has never once had my hand on his arm, and that fitting is the single thing I have been proudest of in this entire trade. Emmett Cray came back to Ashmere that same month in the same good coat, and he was not selling anything this time. He bought Odo's roots out from under me first, not the boy, the routes. He went to the 3 post houses and the Ford Landing and the Barge Master, and paid each of them a retainer for first sight of anything moving toward Ashmere, and by the end of the week, our news was arriving second. Odo came and told me about it himself, angrily, and offered to run the Roof Road and the North Bank at night for nothing until it was sorted, and I told him that nobody who works for me works for nothing, and we settled on double for a month. The Barge Master was the one who stung. He has taken my sister's letters for 2 years, and he sat on his own gunwale and told me plainly that Cray had offered him 11 silver a year for first sight, and that 11 silver a year is his daughter's dowry, and that he was sorry. I told him to take it. He asked me twice whether I meant it. I said a man who turns down 11 silver out of loyalty to a bench that cannot pay him is a man who will resent us by winter, and that I would rather buy the second sight of everything at a price we could both live with. He carried our letters at the old rate for 6 more years and told Cray nothing that was not already public, and I did not ask him to, and I have never once regretted an afternoon more usefully spent than that one. The bench went in the night of the 11th. Somebody came over the yard wall with a maul and broke the top, the vise, the 2 jigs Garrow had built, and every one of the pear wood forms Wren had carved since the first one. They did not touch the iron. That is how I knew it was not a thief, and it was not the crown. A thief takes the metal, and the crown takes the paper, and whoever came over that wall came for the tools of a trade, and knew exactly which 4 things to break. Ice, like Trinas Gascrias, Yisperni Freech Nathango in Nice. Why discretion like size? Adosas got their guy before me. 9 years of carved forms. Every arm she had ever measured in this town split across the grain with a maul, and she was standing in the middle of it, picking up the pieces and sorting them by size out of pure habit. She did not say anything about the forms. She asked me one question, which was whether the man who did this had needed to look at the bench to know what to break, and I said no. And she said then somebody had told him and went to get a broom. Mira had the yard cleared and a list of what was gone written out before the second bell, and she did not put the deep seat board on the list because she had taken it into the house the night I burned my hand and had not mentioned it to me since. I stale sension wine furiek. Hal Dunn found the shackle stock at second bell the next morning, and he found it because he had been looking for cheap iron for me for a month and had got into the habit of reading the Crown's own sale lists. The Assize sells its worn shackle and block iron as scrap when it re-equips at 4 coppers the pound because it is soft, badly forged, and nobody in the trade wants it. There were 200 weight of it, sitting in the Crown's own yard in Ashmere. We bought the lot with the last of Mard's advance, hauled it across the yard on a borrowed dray, and had a new bench top, a new vice bed, and 4 new jigs by dark, because there were 19 people working on it, and Garo does not need a drawing twice. Nobody said anything clever about it at the time. It was cheap iron, and we needed a bench, and the crown had sold it to us, and the significance of that afternoon did not arrive for another year and a half. Cray watched the rebuild from the far side of the yard for most of the day. He had a small book, the same as before. Idisuidius Tashguayisto one Sanus door, and he wrote in it half a dozen times. Odo went and stood behind him, because he is 14 and has no fear whatsoever, and came back and told me what was in the book. Not the bench, not the output, not the sockets. Names. Ren, Bram, Garo, and Odo, in a column, with the number of days each of them had been learning written beside them, and a fifth line at the bottom with a question mark on it where a fifth student would go. The jolt came at the 4th hour of the morning, and I was on my feet before I was awake, with my back against the workshop wall and my heart going like a hammer. 5 limbs had gone to full load at once. Not workload. The load a man puts on a thing when he is hanging his whole weight off it, or swinging it at something, 5 of them together, north and east of me, and then a heartbeat later, one of them stopped. That is the entire message. 5, hard, that way, then 4. No name, no road, no reason, and no way on earth to tell the difference between a man dead and a jaw sheared off at the cam. Garo had gone out the previous afternoon with a wagon of 11 finished anchors for the column's forward bench, and 2 of the newer holders with him, and there were 5 fitted people on that road, and I knew that much only because Mira keeps a book. I have never hated the gift, as I hated it standing in that yard in the dark. It had woken me to tell me that somewhere out of sight, in a direction, some number of people I had put my own hands on were fighting for their lives, and then it had nothing else to say. Odo went out on the roof road at first light without being told, and I sent Seth down to the forward landing, and then I stood in the yard and waited, which is the worst work I have ever done. Odo was back by the middle of the morning with the shape of it, and he had it from Kestelyle at the crossing, who had watched the whole thing go past her from the far bank. 3 men had stopped the wagon at the elbow of the ford road where the trees come down, not on the crown road. On the stretch Mard's patrols do not cover, which is a piece of local knowledge that no traveler has and that anybody who has been asking questions in Ashmere for 2 months would have. They had taken the 11 anchors, the horse, and the wagon. They had taken Garo. The 2 holders had been left on the road, one with a broken jaw and one who had run 4 miles to the ford and could not speak for shaking. Kesta had already sent her boy to the Ash Company post before she sent anybody to me, because she is not sentimental, and she was not going to have a wagon fight on her crossing. Mard's escort was on the road before my message reached her. That is the whole of the payment she made me, and it is more than the money would have been. She had 11 troopers on the ford road within the hour, and she had done it on her own authority, without a paymaster's signature, on a promise nobody had written down. And when I got there, she was already sitting on her horse at the elbow of the road reading the ruts. Estelyle would not move a boat until she was paid. She stood on her own landing with her hand out and named her price in front of an officer of the crown, which took a kind of nerve I still admire. 2 silver for the crossing, and 1 for the ferry to be held on this bank until it was over, because a boat sitting idle is a boat not earning, and she was not going to be told that a marked man's emergency was her contribution. I paid it out of Mira's box. Mard offered to requisition the crossing, and Kesta told her pleasantly that the crown had requisitioned her father's boat in the Old King's War and had not paid for it yet. And Mard put her purse away and let me settle it. Then Kesta told us where they had gone, and she told us for nothing, because the price was for the boat and the information was not for sale. Upstream track on the north bank, toward the old charcoal burner's ground, which is the only place within a morning's walk where you can put a wagon out of sight. Bram set the order on the bank before anybody moved. He had 11 troopers, 9 of our own, and a captain, and he arranged them without once looking at me, and Mard let him do it, because she had watched him drill a queue outside a courthouse. 2 lines, 4 paces, no running. The fitted men in front, because a jaw that closes on a shoulder cable does not open when a man is frightened, and the frightened is what everybody in that clearing was going to be. The fight took less time than the argument about it afterwards, And there were 4 of them in that clearing and not 3. 2 ran at the first sight of the troopers. One put a bill hook into a trooper's shoulder and was on the ground 8 seconds later, with Seth's hook holding his wrist against a stump, and Seth counting under his breath the way Bram taught him. The 4th had Garrow and a knife and was standing in the wagon bed, and he wanted the road and the horse and half an hour. And he was going to get none of those things. Bram talked him out of the wagon. It took about 4 minutes, and it was the least dramatic thing that happened all week. He told the man the count of what was standing in front of him, told him what happens to a roadman who kills a crown trooper's prisoner, and then told him that the 2 who ran had already left him. He came out. Mard's people had him roped before he was off the wheel. I did not lay a hand on any of them, whatever the version of it that came back to Ashmere had me doing in that clearing. Garrow had been in the wagon bed for 11 hours, with his arm pinned under the anchor crate and a man sitting on the crate. They had broken the fitting to get him quiet. The socket was crushed flat, the cable had been cut, the spring seat was in 3 pieces, and the deep anchor Naldi and I had set in Bay's grain shed had been driven half out of true by whatever they hit it with. He was alive and he was talking. He asked about the 2 holders first, before he asked about himself, and he asked whether the anchors were still in the crate. We got him back to Ashmere on Kesta's ferry, which she held for us, and Naldi had the arm open and cleaned within the hour and told me that the bone had taken it and the man had not. Mard had the 2 of them at her post for 9 days, and she let me be present for the questioning, which she did not have to do, and which she never mentioned to anybody in Veyron. One who talked was the younger. He was a carter out of Laro who had lost a season's work to the widened list, taking his brother, and he had been hired in an inn yard by a man he could not name, who paid in advance in Veyron coin, and told them which stretch of road the patrols do not cover. They were not told to kill anybody. They were told to take the crate and one of the fitters, and to hold the fitter for a week somewhere quiet. And there was a second payment waiting for that week, which nobody ever came to collect. Mard asked him where the tackle came from. He said it came with the job, in a bundle, chain, and hooks and rope, and that he had assumed it was stolen because nobody hands roadmen new shackles. Then she asked me, in front of him, whether I wanted her to write the word Veyron in her report or leave it out, and I told her to write down what the man said and nothing that either of us thought, because a report with a guess in it can be dismissed on the guess. She said that a captain who sends 11 troopers off her own authority to a road her paymasters do not care about would very much like to be able to justify it one day, and that I should not mistake her patience for a long rope. Ren went over the raiders' tackle on the Ford Road while the rest of us were carrying Garrow. Nobody asked her to. She came back with a chain shackle and a pair of wagon hooks, and she put them on the bench in front of me and told me to give her my hand, and she put my fingers on the flat of the shackle where the mark was. 3 strokes and a crossbar in a lozenge. The same mark she had learned by heart off 2 lengths of bar iron in Hal Dunn's forge. On the afternoon, Rhyme's price went to 42 coppers the pound. I could not read it. My left palm has not read a surface since Nib's arm, and I stood there with my fingers on a stamped shackle and could feel that there was something and not what it was. And Ren watched me try and did not say anything about it. Allah read it after her, and then Hal himself, and Hal said it was a yard mark and not a smith's mark, which meant it was stamped on stock, leaving a yard rather than on a finished piece, and that no honest carter in this valley buys shackles from Veyron when Stonewick is a day nearer. That is not proof that Aldous Rhyme hired 4 men to take my student off a road. It is proof that the tackle those men used came out of his yard, which is a different sentence, and Perrin Ash made me say the difference out loud 4 times before he would write anything down. Garrow refused the replacement 11 days later, in the yard, with the whole bench listening, and the new socket already finished on the bench behind him. I had the new socket built. I had the spring seat cut and a deep anchor ready, and Naldi's consent to reseat him, and I had it all standing on the bench when he came in, because I am a man who solves things, and I had solved this one before he asked. He said no. He said it once, and then he sat down and made me listen to the rest of it, which is that he had lain in a wagon bed for 11 hours with a man's boot on his chest, and had spent every one of those hours knowing exactly what his hand could not do. It is not the arm, he said. The arm is fine. I am 51 years old, and I have been the man out in front on a river pier and a ford road, and I do not want to be him again. And if you build me a better hand, I will end up back out there, because you will need me to be, argued. I argued badly and for too long, and I used the words that had always worked, which were that we needed him, and that the bench was short, and that the fitting was already built. He let me finish. Then he asked me whether I was going to decide this one for him as well, and the whole yard heard it. And Mira had turned round from the tally board and was watching me. So I stopped. I asked him what he wanted instead, which is a question I should have led with, and he said he wanted to teach, and that he had been teaching for a year already at the second bench without anybody calling it that. He kept the old socket and the plain cable hand, and he has worn it ever since. He runs the school's bench work now, and he has not gone out on a road in 4 years, and he says the same thing about it every time somebody asks, which is that a man who knows what he is bad at is worth two who do not. That was the first time in my life I let somebody else decide what they could bear. It took a wagon bed and 11 hours and a broken arm to teach me a thing my sister had been saying to me in plain words for 2 years. The season after the Ford Road is the one in which the trade stopped being mine, and it happened while I was doing very little, except sitting in Ashmere reseating anchors. Wren had gone to Stonewick before midsummer, to a bench that had been asking for a tuner since spring. Odo had the North Bank and Columns Ford, and he was 14 and running 2 towns and charging both of them. I did not send anybody. That is the point. Wren took 2 students in Stonewick, and Odo took 2 on the North Bank, and Garrow took 1 in Ashmere. And by the end of that season, there were 9 tuners working in 3 towns, and I had personally trained 4 of them. Mira redrew the register that season into a shape I did not recognize. Names fitted, benches running, tuners by town, and a new column at the far right, which she headed with the word taught, because a person who has taught somebody else is a different kind of asset from a person who has been fitted. 61 in Ashmere, 40 on the North Bank, 31 at Stonewick, and the 100 at Columns Ford, and she read the whole of it out at the supper table on the night the Ford men were sentenced. And Bram made everybody drink out of his cup one at a time before she got to the end. The 5 new ones I have met. 2 of them I did not meet for a year. One of them, a woman in Stonewick called Rosal, had reworked the cable run before I ever shook her hand, and I got told about the improvement by a man in Columns Ford who assumed I already knew. The load in my chest went up like a tide that season. And for the first time, it did not frighten me, because a hum I cannot explain is a hum belonging to work I am no longer doing with my own 2 hands. Perrin Ash filed the shackle and the 2 wagon hooks with the assize as found property from the Ford Road, described exactly with the mark noted and the date, and he entered them under his own name. He told me what he had done afterwards, rather than before. A thing on the record cannot be unfound, he said, and he was not going to accuse any man of anything he could not prove. When the day comes that somebody asks where those shackles were made, he said, the answer will already be written down in the Crown's own hand and not in ours. Theodore Lask lost his right hand at the Spring Assize in Veyrun for a debt of 26 silver that his father's steward had run up against the household name at a horse fair. He was 22 years old. He had never been in front of a court in his life, and the widened list does not ask whose hand signed for the money, only whose name is on it. His father is Lord Ansel Lask, who holds 4 villages, 2 mills, and the North Bank timber, and who had spent his son's whole life explaining to that son why the law is the same for everybody. He came to Ashmere in the 4th week after the sentence. Not a steward, not a letter, not a summons for me to attend him at his house. He rode into the blockyard with 2 men, got off his horse, stood at my bench, and waited to be noticed, which took some time, because nobody working there believed what they were looking at. He asked whether I was the man. I said I was. He asked what it would cost, and I told him the truth, which was that fitting his son was a hall offense, and that I could not lawfully take a coin from him for it. Then he said the sentence that made everything after it possible. He said that he was aware of the law and had helped to enforce it for 19 years, and that he had come anyway, and would I please look at his son. Theodore was in the inn with the wrap still on, and would not come out. That is the piece nobody in the market ever heard about, because a lord's son who cannot walk across a yard is not a story anybody repeats. I went to him instead and sat on the end of the bed, and did not look at the arm at all to begin with, and we talked about horses, which I know nothing about. Then he asked me whether it hurt, meaning the fitting, and I told him the truth about that too, which is that the seating is 2 hours of pressure, and the worst of it is holding still, and that I have never met anybody who found it worse than the wrap coming off in front of a room. He asked to be done at night. indoors, with the shutters closed and nobody in the room but his father and me. I told him no in an in-room, to a man 4 weeks out of a courtroom with the wrap still on his arm. I have thought about that refusal more than any other single decision in this trade. It was not a kind thing to say to a frightened man, and I said it anyway, and I would say it again. I told him that I had fitted 61 people in Ashmere, and that every one of them had been seen doing it, in a yard, in daylight, in front of people who thought less of them for it. I told him that, if the Lord's Son gets it done in the dark, then the yard learns that a hand is shameful, when there is a name attached to it worth protecting, and that Bram Otley had sat against a wall for 4 years, being looked at, and had earned the right not to have that undone in one night by a boy with a good coat. Then I said the practical half, because I am not a preacher. There are 11 people in this valley who will still not come to a bench because they think this trade is charity for the ruined. Every one of them will come if they watch it done to you. Did not answer me for a long time. Then he asked whether his father would have to watch, and I said yes, and he said all right then, and asked what day. We did it on a market Thursday, on a trestle in the open, in the middle of the Ashmere market, with the stalls trading around us, and Wren's pitch 9 feet away, and a crowd 4 deep by the second hour. Naldi ran it. She had examined him twice, and she would not let me start until she had, and she stood at his shoulder for the whole 2 hours with her hand on his pulse and told me twice to slow down. It was very good. He held still for 2 hours and 11 minutes with the market watching, and he did not make a single sound. And when it was done and I let go of his arm, he sat there for a moment and then picked up a cup of small beer off the trestle and told his father it was cold. Lord Lask, who had stood in that market for 2 hours in front of 400 people and had not sat down once, put his hand over his mouth and turned round. The market made a noise I have not heard before or since, not a cheer. Annika Toll started it by pricing the fitting out loud in loaves the way she always does. And by the time she got to the end of her sum, half the market was doing arithmetic and the other half was crying, which is Ashmere entirely. Theodore came back to the yard 9 days later on his own, without his father and without the 2 men, and worked a full day at the bench filing socket edges badly and refusing to be thanked for it. He has done it every month since. He will not be called a patron, and he will not have his name on anything. And when a Larrow man asked him at the bench whether it was true that a Lord's Son had been done in the open market, he held up his own hand and said that it was, and went back to filing. McCrae reached the Lask household 11 days after that market Thursday, with a velvet roll under his arm, and a proposal he had clearly written on the road. I know what was said in that room, because Lord Lask told me himself, twice, once in temper, and once carefully with his steward present, so that it could be written down. Cray offered a steel hand of the newest pattern, free of any indenture, as a councilnas transactions, nourished as a gift to the household, plus a standing supply for any of Lask's tenants at half the Veyron price. Then he made his mistake, and it was a small one, and it was fatal. He observed that a family of standing might find it awkward at court to be associated with a marked craftsman working outside the halls, and he offered the gift as a way of putting that difficulty away quietly. Lask asked him whether he had been standing in the Ashmere market on the Thursday. Cray said truthfully that he had not, and that he had been in Larrow on his employer's business. 400 people watched a marked man give my son back the feeling in his own hand, Lask told him. The valley knows who did it and who stood there while it was done, and a household that takes a quiet gift now looks like a household ashamed of the best morning of its year. He refused him to his face, and then he did the thing that actually mattered, which was to put it in writing. A household warrant. The school of tuners entered as a craft of the Lask household. Its members retained servants of that house, working under his warrant instead of a hall license. It is a form of words about 4 centuries old, and it exists so that a lord can keep his own farrier without asking a guild's permission for him. It's covered Ashmere and the North Bank, because those are his lands. It did not cover Stonewick, which is Payne's ground and the Crown's. For 11 days, it was the best news the bench had ever had. 9 tuners who could not be closed down on a Tuesday. Fittings done in daylight with a warrant nailed to the yard post. 2 towns where the word unlicensed stopped being a thing anybody could arrest you for. Then Wren came back from Stonewick and read it and put it down on the bench and said she would not work under it. The argument took the whole of an evening, and most of the yard heard it, and I lost it in front of everybody, and losing it was the right outcome and did not feel like one at the time. Her case was 4 sentences long. A warrant is a permission. A permission is held by the man who granted it. A marked craft that works under a lord's roof is exactly as free as that lord's opinion of it next year and his son's opinion after that. I said the alternative was that 9 people stopped working. She said the alternative was 9 people working and belonging to a household. I spent 7 years as security on a debt I never signed, she said. I am not taking the position again because this time the tools are better. I said Lask was a decent man. She said that was the entire problem, that a decent man's warrant is the most comfortable prison anybody had ever offered her, and that comfort is how the marked lose things. Then I said the unforgivable one, which was that I had built this trade with my own hands and had paid for it with parts of them. She let it sit. Then she said that the spring seat in every socket in 3 towns was hers, and the deep seat board was written in her hand, and that we could certainly have the conversation about who had built what. And I should think first about whether I wanted the answer read out in that yard. Perrin Ash had been standing in the doorway for most of it with a roll of parchment under his arm, waiting, because he had known where the argument was going before either of us did. He put the old charter on the bench and read the wording he had found 3 months before and had told nobody about, because he had been waiting for somebody who could use it. A guild mark certifies the work, that is the old wording, from the founding of the halls, and it certifies a piece of work as sound. It says nothing whatsoever about licensing the man or the woman who made it, because in that century, the halls did not license people at all. The mark can be granted to a piece. The piece can be examined, tested, weighed, and stamped by any 2 members of a hall in a market, and if it passes, the mark goes on the work, and the work then carries the hall's warranty into any court in the kingdom. Ren stood there with her fingers on the parchment for a long time. Then she asked Perrin whether the wording had ever been repealed, and he said it had not. It had merely been forgotten, which in a guild is not the same thing at all. She left 9 days later for Stonewick with 4 of the 9 tuners and both of the students who had not finished, and she took the deep seat board and left us a copy in her own hand, which is more than she owed me. We did not part badly, whatever the valley says about it, and what the valley says had us shouting at each other across a bench for an hour. She came to the bench on the morning she left and told me she would certify our work when she had the standing to do it, that she expected our tolerances to be worth certifying, and that she would be checking them herself. What the split cost us was arithmetic, and I had it from Mira inside a day. 9 tuners had been running 4 benches. 5 tuners were now running the same 4 benches, and the Columns Ford Company was due for its seasonal reseeding in 11 weeks. She had a second figure for me as well, which was that half the students who left had been fitted in Ashmere and were still on her register, and that she was not going to strike a single name off it because 2 schools had a disagreement about warrants. Bram passed the cup that same week to the first tuner to finish the full drill, a woman off the North Bank called Issa Varick, who had been sentenced for short wait at a bakery. He did not make a speech about that either. He filled it, handed it over, and told her that the drill was hers now, and that she was to teach it as written until she found something better, at which point she was to write down what she found and send it back to him. 4 copies of the drill went out to 4 benches that month in 4 different hands, and every one of them came back inside a year with corrections in the margin. Marek Dow settled his account the same week, and settled it in leather. 9 hides, cut, boiled, and graded to a standard he worked out himself with Naldi, because he had watched his brother's socket rub and had opinions about it. That grade is in every socket in the kingdom now. He never asked for a copper, and he never let anybody call it a gift, and he made me take the whole 9 hides at once so that nobody could say the tanner had been paying the school in installments for a fitting. Odo came in at the end of that month, off the North Bank and the Larrow Road, and he had been 3 weeks among the towns where Rhyme's earliest clients live, and he had a count. 19 failures, he said, all of them the first pattern, all of them men fitted 2 winters or more ago, and all of them the same complaint, which is that the socket no longer sits where it was built to sit, and the arm underneath it has changed shape. Then he told me the second half of his count, which he had made himself by asking at 6 post houses. Every one of those 19 men is still paying 9 coppers a month, and the paper says the payment runs against the device until the device is discharged, and not one of them can afford to stop. The first of them came in on a wet Tuesday and stood outside the yard gate for most of an hour before anybody could get him through it. His name was Callum Fisk. He was a barge hand off the North Bank. He had been sentenced for 4 silver of debt in the first month of the widened list, and he had worn one of Rhymes' steel hands for 2 years and 3 months. He would not come to the bench. He stood at the gate with his hat in his left hand and told Bram that he understood he had gone to the other table, that he had signed the paper, and that he had not come to ask for anything. Bram brought him in by the elbow the way he brings everybody in, sat him down and poured for him out of the cup, and told him that the only man in this yard entitled to be ashamed of a fitting was a man who had done one badly. The arm underneath was a mess. Not infected and not the surgeon's fault. Whatever the version of this is that gets told in yards where Rhymes' work is called slapdash. His socket was excellent, and it had been built 2 years ago to an arm that had been 4 weeks off the block. A stump shrinks for a year and a half after the cut and then thickens again if the man goes back to work. Callum's arm had done both. The socket fitted a limb that no longer existed, and because Rhymes' anchor is fixed into the socket and the socket is finished as one piece, there is no adjustment anywhere in it. Not a screw, not a leaf, not a strap that changes anything. That is the same property that makes his hands so good. A fixed seat is rigid, and a rigid seat transmits force beautifully, and it will never, ever move again, which means that the day the arm changes shape, the hand becomes a splint with a grip on the end of it. Naldi came down and looked at 11 of them across that first fortnight, and she gave me the number that mattered. Every one of Rhymes' earliest pattern, worn by a working man for 2 years or more, will do this. It is not a fault, it is the design, and the design cannot be repaired in place. We could rebuild them. Our socket is a shell, a ring, a spring leaf, and a cable, all of it separable, and any competent tuner can pull a man's anchor and reseat it. 19 of Rhymes' early clients were within a day's ride of Ashmere. Then Perrin Ash read us the paper Callum had been carrying, folded in his hat for 2 years and 3 months. It is a personal indenture, written to Aldous Rhyme and not to the Crown. The debt is 9 coppers a month for a term of 11 years, and Perrin read the recital clause out twice because it is where the whole thing lives. The obligation is entered against the device. The wearer covenants to maintain and preserve the device issued to him, and the debt is stated as being for the value of that device, and the term runs until the device is discharged or the sum is satisfied. Perrin put his finger on the line and asked me what happens if the device comes off the man's arm and goes back to the man who made it. I did not understand him at first. Mira did. She said it out loud before I got there, which she enjoyed a great deal and has never once let me forget. The debt is for a specific device, and the device is returned. The debt is against a thing the wearer no longer has and has not damaged. He has not defaulted, he has not destroyed it, he has not run. He has handed it back and stopped owing on it. The clause is written that way because Rhyme wanted the debt to survive a change of employer, a change of parish, and a change of crown administration. He tied it to the object so that no court could hand the paper anywhere else, and by tying it to the object, he tied it to the object. Perrin would not let anybody act on it for 4 days. He wrote to a clerk he knew in Veyrun, he read 3 older indenture cases, and he came back and said that in his opinion, a returned device discharges the term, that he was not a judge, and that any man doing this was taking a risk with his own name. Callum Fisk went first because he asked to go first. We took Rhymes' hand off him, rebuilt his socket to the arm he has now, seated him properly with Naldi standing there, and Garrow packed the steel hand in straw in its own box with the indenture number written on the lid. Odo carried it to the Veyrun yard himself and got a receipt for it, signed, dated, in Rhymes' own clerk's hand, because a clerk who is handed a device and a number does what clerks do. That receipt is the single most valuable piece of paper this trade has ever held, and it cost us a boy's fare upriver. Callum felt the rain on the back of his own hand standing in our yard 4 days later, which he had not done in 2 years and 3 months, and then he sat down on the step and put his head in his hands and stayed there a while. Then he went and told the North Bank. That is the whole of my strategy, and there was nothing else in it. I did not send criers out. I fixed one barge hand properly, and he could not stop talking about it. 14 came the first week, 31 the second. By the end of the season, we had rebuilt 204 of Rhyme's clients, and Odo had made 9 trips upriver with boxes of excellent steel hands and had 9 receipts in a bundle. Rhyme's clerk stopped signing receipts after the 9th box. Nei corseis, gateseis. The 11th trip, Odo was left standing in that yard for 4 hours, and then told that no person there was authorized to accept a device, and he came home with the box still on his shoulder. Perrin had the answer ready, because he had expected it a fortnight earlier. A thing tendered and refused is still tendered, provided the tender is witnessed and recorded, and there is a form of words for it that is older than the hand statute. So, we did it in the open. The box, the indenture number, the man's name, delivered at the gate of the Veyron yard, in front of 2 witnesses off the street, with the refusal noted, and a copy of the note left with the barge master and another with Perrin in Ashmere. After the 4th of those, Rhyme's clerk started signing again, because a refusal recorded in front of strangers 11 times over is a thing that gets read out in a hall one day, and a receipt is only a receipt. The men themselves asked the question that kept me awake, Nulfur Wesansraisa Waiske, and Callum asked it first, on behalf of about 40 of them who had put him up to it. Would they be charged twice? Would they get out from under the surgeon's paper and find our paper waiting? Told them what the holding is and what it is not, in front of everybody, and then I did the thing that actually settled it, which was to have Mira read out the terms of the common bench to the whole yard and then hand the sheet to Callum to keep. Not one of them paid us in coin. They could not. They paid the 30 days at whatever bench they could reach, and half of them are still at those benches now, and the school stopped having a shortage of hands somewhere around the 11th week. It flooded us. It was not a triumphal season. It was the hardest work any of us have ever done, and it nearly broke the Ashmere bench in half. We ran 3 shifts. Bram drilled the new holders at first light before the shift began, Garrow ran the second bench, and Isaveric came down from the north bank with both her students. I did nothing at all for 11 weeks except seat anchors and sleep badly with a load in my chest that had stopped being a hum and turned into a sound. Naldi came back to run the medical side of it in the 2nd week, and she did not ask, she simply arrived with 2 boxes and a girl, and told me where the sick room was going. She got her hospital out of that season, and she got it on her own terms. 4 beds in the old cooper's shed, then 8, and clean water carried from the mill leat by 2 freed men who could not yet work a bench. A stove bought with Lask's warrant money, a girl she trained herself, and a standing rule that no anchor is seated in this town on a person she has not examined first. She said one thing about it to me, and only one, on the day the 8th bed went in. The man in Veyron offered her 12 beds 2 years ago, and she said no. She had 8 now and had never once had to explain them to anybody. And 8 beds a woman can look at in the mirror, she said, are more beds than 12. Captain Delamard converted in public in the 9th week, and she did it in front of the 2 paymasters who had refused to sign her service fee. Her company had 100 of my fittings and about 40 of Rhymes issued to her newer men under the Crown's arrangement, and 11 of those 40 had gone the way Callum's went. She brought the paymasters to Columnsford, stood them in the barracks yard, and had 2 of her men do exactly what I had done in my own yard with a cloth over 4 objects, one of them wearing steel and one of them wearing ours. Then she told them, in her own voice and in front of about 90 men, that she had refused to pay a service fee 2 years ago because she believed she was buying iron, and that she had been wrong, and that she was now paying it out of the company's own purse, whether the Crown signed or not. She did not apologize to me, and I did not want her to. What she did was worth a great deal more than an apology, because both of those paymasters went back to Veyron, and one of them wrote a report. Crown's number came apart inside 1 quarter, and it went in exactly the shape Mira had drawn on a barge 2 years before. 204 men had stopped paying 9 coppers a month to a supplier the Crown had contracted with. Every one of them had come off the contracted yards and gone back to open work, which meant they were no longer labor the Treasury could count as pledged. The projection was built on a widening list, producing a growing number of indentured workers. It had been drawn 11 years forward and drawn against for 3, and the first quarter in which the number went backwards instead of forwards took the whole shape out of it. Mira worked the figure out from the crier's own sentencing lists and Odo's tallies and the receipts in the bundle, and she was within 4% of the Treasury's own revision when we finally saw it, which I know because Parent Ash saw both. Alice Marrow's answer arrived on the 9th day of the new quarter, by Ryder in a leather case, and it was not the shape of anything I had prepared for. He did not close the benches, he did not send troopers, he did not revoke Lask's warrant, and he did not write one word about the 204 men. He sent a summons requiring Nevin Oric to answer before the Crown's Hall on the charge of unlicensed trade and inciting the marked to withhold their labor, and he left the date blank. An undated summons is a thing I had never heard of, and Perrin had heard of twice. It is lawful. It means the charge stands. The accused is bound to attend, and the Crown fixes the day at its own convenience, which may be next month, or the month after the harvest, or 3 years from now. Aaron explained what it was for, and he did not soften it. It is not for trying me. It is so that every person deciding whether to bring a bench to their town knows that the man who taught them is under an open charge that can be called any morning. Marrow protected the paper, not the men in the yards, not the 204, not his own projection, and not the treasury clerks who were going to have to explain the quarter. He protected the record he had built by putting the fault on a name. Aldous Rhyme moved before the ink was dry on that summons, and he moved on the only thing that has ever actually stopped us. He bought the anchor iron, not the price this time, the stock. Every yard in the valley that had ever sold a bar of it, under contract, in a single week, at prices nobody could refuse, including Stonewick and both yards above the falls and the 2 on the coast road. Haldun came into the yard with the letters, put them on the bench, and did not sit down. 4 hearths, he said. 19 men. No anchor-grade iron coming after the 11th of the month. He had not signed anything and was not going to, and he told me plainly that this was going to hurt his forge a great deal worse than it hurt my bench. Then he asked the question the whole yard was standing there thinking, which was what we make anchors out of, when there is no iron in the valley that a man is allowed to buy. The benches stopped on the 11th of the month, all 4 of them, within 2 days of each other, and the inventory that morning came to 1 item. We had leather from Marrick Dow, 9 hides of it, graded. We had pear wood, cable, harness cord, screw stock, boiled linen, bone glue, forge coal, and 19 trained pairs of hands. We had 4 furnaces and a hospital and a warrant over 2 towns. What we did not have was iron of the right grade for an anchor, and there is no substitute for it. Soft iron spreads under the seat and hard steel cracks at the ring, and I had spent 3 years learning that at a cost of about 11 ruined sockets. Hal tried 4 substitutes in 9 days. Wagon tire, plowshare, cast pot metal, and a bundle of old barge chain that looked promising until it failed in the ring under a 200-pound pull. He came in on the 10th morning with a Crown sale list in his hand, and the look he had worn on the night he found us the shackle stock for a bench top. Not 200 weight of it this time. All of it. Block irons, leg irons, wrist irons, and the chain off the cart that carries men to the block, sitting in Crown yards in 4 towns, because no smith in the kingdom wants it. 1,100 weight of it, at 4 coppers the pound, and Aldous Rhyme had not contracted a single ounce, because a man who buys anchor-grade bar for a fortune does not think to buy the scrap the courts sweep out of their own sheds. Mira bought all of it in 1 afternoon, with the whole of the Lask warrant money, and Mard's service fee, and every copper on the register, and she bought it in her own name, because she holds a paid office and can enter a contract and I cannot. Then she asked me, in front of Hal and Perrin, whether I understood what I was about to make anchors out of, and I said I did, and she said that she wanted it said out loud in the yard, where everybody could hear it before a single bar went into the fire. We hauled it in on 4 drays across 9 days, leg irons from Larrow with the ankle rings still on them, the block chain from Stonewick, 2 carts of wrist irons from Vayrun that had been on men we had rebuilt. Then we forged it in the open. Hal set his portable hearth in the middle of the block yard, on the stones 11 paces from where I had woken up with a rap stump 3 years earlier, and we put the first block chain in the fire in front of anybody who wanted to watch. About 200 people wanted to watch. Annika Toll sold bread to them and priced the iron out loud in loaves as it went into the fire. Bram put the first shackle in himself. He counted under his breath while he did it, the way he does, and he had 4 years of sitting against a wall in that count, and everybody there knew it. Iron would not hold a fixed seat. That is the piece nobody in the crowd understood, and it nearly ended us. Reforged shackle stock is uneven all the way through, work hardened in the bends, soft in the straights, and no matter how carefully Hal folded and drew it, a ring cut from it would sit true for a fortnight and then creep about the thickness of a hair. A fixed seat that creeps is worse than no seat at all, because it drags the anchor line off the bone and takes the feeling with it in 11 days. Darrow put a week into trying to make the metal behave, and then came in one morning and said the sentence that changed the trade, which was that he had been solving the wrong problem, and so had I. "Stop making it hold," he said. "Make it adjust. The metal is going to move, so build a seat that can be set again by hand in a quarter of an hour without opening anything." He and Wren had been circling it from 2 directions for a year. Her spring leaf takes up the swelling of a working day. His was a ring in 2 halves on a fine thread with a graduated collar so that a tuner can let the seat out by a measured amount and reseat the feeling without a full deep seating. It took 19 days, and it is the best thing that has ever come off my bench, and I designed none of it. Then somebody in the yard said the obvious thing out loud, which was that a seat that can be let out as the metal creeps is a seat that can be let out as an arm grows. I sent Odo up the Tannery Street for Marikdow inside the hour, and I did not wait for the second prototype to come off the bench before I did it. His son is called Thomas, and he was 11 years old, and he had been born with the right hand missing, like Odo, which meant the law had never touched him and never would. We did it slow. Naldi examined him twice on 2 different days and made me wait between them. He came to the bench 3 times before we started, and by the second visit, he had renamed every tool on it. The fitting took a whole afternoon, and it was the quietest thing that Yard has ever done. No crowd, at Naldi's insistence. His mother, his father, Naldi, Garrow at the collar, and me on the seat. Child's arm cannot take a deep anchor, and it does not need one. We seated it shallow on the graduated collar, and I held his wrist and set the line, and I talked to him about a dog the whole way through it, because he was frightened, and because Pitch was asleep under the trestle and was an easier subject than the arm. He felt his mother's hand first. She had it on his shoulder, and then she moved it down to hold the new one, and he looked at it and then at her, and asked her why her hand was warm, and she could not answer him. Marikdow paid for it in leather for the 3rd time in 4 years, and would not hear a word about the account being settled. He said that a tanner who cannot pay in hides is a poor tanner, and that he intended to be paying us in hides for another 20 years. The collar goes out 4 turns a year on that boy's arm. Garrow has done every one of them himself, and Thomas Dow is a bench hand at 14 now and reads a socket edge better than most of the tuners. Wren came back to Ashmere in the 2nd week of the harvest with a stamped seal blank in her pocket and a hallmark on a piece of her own work. She had spent 9 months on it and done all of it by Perrin's old wording. She took a carved case to the Stonewick Hall unnamed, with no maker's mark, and required 2 members to examine it under the founding charter, which they could not refuse in public. They tested it. It passed. They stamped the work, because the charter says a mark certifies a piece and says nothing at all about the person who made it, and the 2 men who put the stamp on it did not know whose hands had done the carving until she told them afterwards. Then she did it 11 more times with sockets, rings, collars, and a full cable hand, and by the end of it, the Stonewick Hall had certified 12 pieces of marked work and had a book full of its own stamps saying so. That gave her standing to open a certifying bench of her own under the Hall's own procedure, which she did in the 9th month, and it means that a piece of work coming off any bench in 3 towns can now carry a hallmark into any court in this kingdom. She cannot hold a personal license, and she never will. What she can do is certify the work of anybody at all, marked or whole, and that is the one thing I could never do. She came to the yard and told me herself before she told anybody else, and she brought the stamped case with her and put my fingers on the mark, and then she remembered what my palm is now and read it out to me instead. Osric Payne came to Stonewick himself when the 12th stamp went into the book, and he did not come to shout because that has never been his method. He asked his own 2 members, in front of Wren, whether the pieces were sound work. They said yes. He asked whether they would have certified them knowing whose hands made them, and one said yes, and the other said he did not know. Then he asked Wren what she wanted, and she told him. Examination, by the charter, no question asked about the maker, and a fee to the Hall on every piece, which is money the Halls have never had off the marked in the history of this kingdom. He did not agree, and he did not forbid it. He said he would not instruct any member to refuse an examination his own founding charter requires, and that he intended to spend the winter reading that charter properly. Trey was in Ashmere within a fortnight of the first shackle going into Hal's fire, and for once, he was not writing in a book. He tried to buy the crown scrap out from under us at 3 times what Mira had paid in 4 towns, and found that a woman with a paid office had taken delivery of every pound of it already, and had the receipts entered at the assize. Then he stood and watched 200 people watch us reforge leg irons into anchors, and told me his employer had not expected us to see the winter out, and would want to know how it had been managed. I told him to write down exactly what he had seen. Bram asked for the deep seat at the end of that month, and I had been expecting it for a year and dreading it for longer. He is 56. His anchor is the strapped bone seat, the second one I ever built, set in a workshop by lamplight with a screw and a plate, and it had been drifting for 2 years and taking longer to come back every season. Naldi examined him and said the bone would take it. She also said in front of him that a deep seat on a man of his age is a thing she would allow once and not twice, and that he should understand he was spending his last one. He said he had counted on it lasting him out and had done the arithmetic himself, which is a thing I did not know he could do until that afternoon. Mira asked me not to. Not out loud in the yard this time. She came and stood in the workshop doorway and asked me quietly instead, and she said that she was not going to argue with me about it, and that she wanted it on the record that she had asked. I did it anyway. 2 hours and 40 minutes, the longest one I have ever done, with Naldi calling the time and Garrow's hands on the collar and Issa Varick watching every move so that somebody else would have seen it done on an old man's bone. Bram felt the tea in his own cup that evening and told the yard it was too hot, and then he drilled the new intake at first light the next morning as though nothing had happened at all. What it cost me came out of the other side of my hand, not the fingers, which are dull, and not the palm, which reads nothing. The back of my left hand and the inside of the wrist went, and that is where a person feels fine texture without ever thinking about it. Mira found out a week later. She had come in behind me while I was working and put her head against my shoulder for a moment, which she does about twice a year, and my hand went up to her hair the way it has since she was 15. I felt weight. That is the whole of it. Weight and warmth and the fact of something being there, and nothing at all of what hair actually is. She knew before I said anything because she watched my hand stop. She did not shout at me, and she did not cry in front of me, and what she said was that she was going to be the one who wrote down what each of these had cost, since I clearly was not going to, and that she had started the column 2 years ago. The summons came back with a date on it 11 days later, the first sitting after the turn of the year, in the Crown's Hall at Veyrun, on the charge of unlicensed trade and inciting the marked to withhold their labor. Aaron read the second document in the same packet twice, and then sat down on the bench, which is not a thing he does. Aldous Ream had filed his contract with the court as proof of his standing to be heard at that hearing, not a summary of it. The whole instrument, entered into the record, open to any clerk, any scribe, and any man who can persuade a court that he has an interest in it, including one marked craftsman standing in the dock. Perrin had a fair copy off a Veyrun clerk inside 9 days, and he read it to me at the workshop table with a candle between us, all 11 clauses, in the order they stand. Sole supply of crown-issued limbs throughout the realm for a term of 20 years, and no other maker to be issued a crown contract. And in exchange, Ifar Wal Instje, on his own offer and in his own drafting, a guarantee to maintain and keep in service every limb so issued anywhere in the kingdom at his own charge for the life of the wearer. Allspiken Regents. Also, I asked him to read that last one again. He read it again. I did not say anything at all, and Perrin, who has known me for 4 years, did not ask. Then I went and found Mira, and I asked her whether she could get me a count from the crier's lists and Odo's tallies and the assize rolls of every dead limb issued under the crown's arrangement since the list was widened, town by town, with the dates. She looked at me for a moment and then said that she could have it in 11 days, and that she would want to know what it was for before she wrote it down, and I told her she would know when I did. The charge was read at the second hour by a clerk with a cold in a hall with a green stone floor, and it took him less than a minute. Nevin Oric, marked of Ashmere, charged with the practice of a licensed trade without license, and with inciting the marked to withhold their labor from the Crown's contracted yards. On the first, a fine at the court's discretion. On the second, the block. They meant the left one. That is not a detail anybody spelled out, and everybody in that room understood, because the right one was already off, and the statute says the hand, not a particular hand. Mira sat behind me with the register on her knees and 2 boxes of tallies at her feet. Parent Ash sat at the scribe's table in his own office because nobody had thought to refuse a scribe leave to attend. Aldous Rhymes sat in the gallery in a good coat, and he had filed his contract into that record himself 6 weeks earlier to establish his standing to be heard. Marrow opened for the Crown. He was fair, which is worse than cruel in a room like that. He said the Crown held no malice, that the accused had done a great deal of good, and that the law does not become optional because the man breaking it is useful. Then he had the licensing order read, and then he had the yard's own numbers read, because the Crown had my sister's register from 3 years back, and used it as evidence of the scale of the offense. I said very little for the first hour. Perrin had told me on the barge that the last hour of a hearing belongs to whoever is right, and that I was to spend nothing early. Rhymes' contract went into the record in the middle of the morning on his own application. The clerk read the whole instrument, because a filed instrument is read entire, and Rhymes sat through it with the pleasant look of a man hearing his own foundations described. Sole supply of Crown-issued limbs throughout the realm for 20 years. No other maker to be granted a Crown contract. And in exchange, in his own drafting and on his own offer, a guarantee to maintain and keep in service every limb so issued anywhere in the kingdom, at his own charge, for the natural life of the wearer. I asked the court's leave to speak on the charge of trade without license. Marrow gave it because he is not a coward and because he wanted the record complete. I said that I had built a pattern, that it consisted of a shell socket, a bone ring, a spring leaf, a graduated collar, a shoulder cable, and a jaw, that any competent smith could make the whole of it out of scrap in 4 days, and that I had a drawing of every piece of it with me. Then I gave it away, standing in the dock, before the Crown had finished deciding what to do with my other hand. I said it to the hall, out loud, with the clerk's writing. The pattern of the mechanical limb belongs to nobody from this morning. Any smith in this kingdom may build it, sell it, improve it, or copy it. I ask no fee, no royalty, no acknowledgement, and no license from anybody for the use of it, now or at any time. Mira put 9 fair copies on the clerk's table. Perrin had made them in his own hand over 11 nights, from Garrow's jigs and Wren's boards, each one signed, dated, and witnessed by 2 men who had never met me. The court asked me twice whether I understood I was surrendering property. Marrow asked it once, and the presiding justice asked it again, and I said yes both times, and asked that my answer be entered in the same words. There was a long noise in that hall, and it was not applause. It was about 80 people all explaining the same thing to each other at once, and the loudest of them were the 4 smiths who had come up from Larrow to watch a man be sentenced, and were now standing there holding a drawing. I'm understood before anybody else in the room. I watched the whole thing land on him in about 4 seconds, and then I watched him decide to fight it, which was the first bad decision he had made in 3 years. He asked leave to be heard. He said, correctly, that a free pattern does not affect his contract at all, that the Crown's arrangement stands, and that he remained the sole supplier of Crown-issued limbs for another 17 years. Perrin Ash stood up at the scribe's table and asked the court's leave to put a question to the record rather than to the surgeon, which is a scribe's privilege, and which I have never seen used before or since. His question was how many limbs the Crown had issued under the arrangement since the list was widened, and whether the maintenance guarantee attached to each of them. Marrow's own clerk answered, because it was a matter of the Crown's record, and not of opinion. 2,140 issued in 19 towns. The guarantee attaches to everyone. Mira read the second half from the floor, and she had leave because Perrin had asked for it and because the Crown itself had been quoting her register all morning. 204 of the earliest pattern rebuilt at Ashmere and its benches, she said, every one of them, because the fixed socket no longer fitted the arm. 37 more failed and not yet rebuilt on the north bank. 11 of the 40 issued to the Ash Company, and by the surgeon's own word to this court, his limbs hold 4 years. Then she said, the piece that took the room. Of the 2,140, 1,690 are into their 3rd year or beyond. The guarantee is at his own charge for the life of the wearer, and it does not end when a device fails. He is bound to maintain every one of them. And the exclusivity he wrote it in exchange for is worth nothing from this morning, because any smith in this hall can make the mechanical part for the price of the iron. Rhyme bargained. That is the thing I will remember longest, because I had spent 3 years thinking of him as a man who could not be moved, and what he did in that hall was haggle. He offered first to accept a shared contract rather than sole supply if the guarantee were read down to the Crown's own yards. The court said the instrument was his own drafting and it was filed entire. Then he offered to maintain only the limbs still in service, and then only those under 5 years, and then only those in the 4 towns where he keeps a yard, and each offer was smaller than the one before it, and the hall could hear him shrinking. What finished him, he said in temper, which I had not believed he had in him. He said that he had not written the widened list, that he had advised on it and no more, and that the man who drafted it was sitting at the Crown's own table. The hall turned round and looked at Ellis Marrow, and Marrow did not deny it, because it was true, and there were 9 clerks present who had copied it. Marrow lost the model in the next quarter of an hour, and he lost it to arithmetic and not to anger. Mira put her projection beside the Treasury's own figures, and the Treasury's own figures had been read into the record that morning by the Crown, so neither document could be called into question without calling the other one down with it. Bakranai. The model requires the sentence to stay indentured. 204 had stopped being so. The revenue had been drawn against 3 years forward, and the maintenance liability the Crown had loaded onto one supplier had just been shown to be unpayable, which meant the Crown would carry it, which meant the model cost money instead of making it. He asked her one question, and to his credit it was the right one, which was where she had got the sentencing counts. She said from the crier's own lists, town by town, carried by a boy who was paid a copper a mile, and that every date could be checked against the assize rolls in the room next door. Marrow sat down. He did not concede anything out loud. He simply stopped speaking for the rest of the session, in front of the Treasury men he had sold the model to, and one of them got up and left before the hearing ended. Rhyme's own clients finished him in the end, in that hall, and I did not say one word for the whole of it. 11 of them had come up on the barge with us, and about 90 more were outside, and they had not come for me. They had come because Callum Fisk had spent 9 days walking the North Bank, telling men who could not read that a paper about their hands was going to be read out loud in Veyrun. When the guarantee was read the second time, one nas a chance, and a man at the back asked, in an ordinary voice, whether that meant the surgeon owed him a working hand. The clerk said that the instrument was on the record, and that the court could not unsay a filed guarantee. And that was the whole of the spark. Somebody carried it out to the yard, and the yard carried it to the street. And inside a quarter of an hour, there were 200 men at the doors of that hall holding up right hands that no longer worked and asking, quite politely at first, when the maintenance was going to start. They were not a mob. Not one window was broken. The justice adjourned twice, and the second time, the crowd let his chair through without being asked, which frightened the court a great deal more than shouting would have. Rhyme went out by a side door with 2 of his own men. I have not spoken to him since, and I have never wanted to. The court came back in the afternoon and did 3 things, and it did them in the order that suited the Crown, which is the order I would have chosen myself. The licensing order for tuning was suspended pending review, on the grounds that a trade whose mechanical part is now in the public hand cannot be restricted on grounds of public safety alone. The charge against me died with it. Unlicensed practice cannot stand where the license itself is suspended, and inciting the marked to withhold labor was withdrawn by the Crown, which is to say by Marrow, who withdrew it himself in one sentence without looking up. The hand list was struck for debt, for short weight, and for poaching in the same session, because the Crown had just been shown in public that sentencing men for money loses money. Anden nasta folpot escondidine, volta plobis by. Though the block stands for violence, it stands today. I have never said this ended the statute, and it did not, and there are men in this kingdom who will still lose a hand for what they do with the other one. Ren had the certification written into the striking. She was not in the hall, she was in Stonewick, and she had sent Perrin 4 lines of wording 9 days before with instructions to get them in wherever a gap appeared. The wording is that work certified under a hall's founding charter is lawful work wherever it is made, by whatever hand. It went into the record as a clause of the review, and nobody argued with it, because by then, the court wanted the whole business closed and off the table. I walked out of that hall at about the 5th hour with no charge against me, no craft that belonged to me, no exclusive right to anything, and 9 copies of my own drawings loose in a room full of smiths. Osric Payne had come up for the hearing at his own expense to speak for the halls on the licensing question, and he never got to make his argument, because the license he had come to defend was suspended before he was called. He found me on the steps instead. He said that he had come to Veyron to stop me and had watched me hand away the only thing in the room worth money, and he asked me straight out whether it had been a tactic. I told him it was both, and that I had known what it would do to the surgeon's contract when I did it, and that I would have done it anyway a year later for nothing when the school got big enough to stop needing me. He said that was the first honest answer he had ever had out of anybody in this business. Then he asked what a hall was supposed to do now, and I told him his own charter had more in it than he thought. 2 of the Laro Smiths caught me before the bottom step with the drawing already open, wanting to know why the ring sits below the joint and not above it. I explained the load line to 2 strangers in the street until the steps had emptied, and one of them argued with me. Odo was on the steps with the barge times. He wanted to know whether we had won, and I told him I did not know yet, and he said that 4 Laro Smiths had already gone off to find a copyist, which was the actual answer to his question. Mira came out last with her boxes. She sat down on the hall steps in front of the whole of Veyron and did not say anything for a while. And then she said that she had 1 more figure, and she was going to give it to me whether I wanted it or not. Every dead limb in this kingdom is now somebody's obligation, she said, and every smith in this kingdom can build the moving part of ours by the end of the month. And there is exactly 1 thing left in the world that a man cannot copy out of a drawing. Then she said, and you have spent 3/4 of your left hand on it, and there are 9 people who can do it, and 5 of them you have never taught. The blockyard came up for sale in the 3rd month after the striking, because a crown that no longer takes hands for debt has no use for a walled yard with a stone block in the middle of it. Mira bought it. Not the school, not the holding, not me. She stood at the assize table with the certified sum in a box and put her own name on the conveyance, and Perrin Ash entered it and read it back to her twice at her own request. 412 silver for the yard, the 2 sheds and the well. She had the sum together from the certification fees, the Columns Ford service contract, and the sale of the last of Rhymes returned steel to a smith in Laro who wanted the ratchet pattern. We melted the rest of the shackle stock in the yard on the day the deed was read, in the open, with the gates propped and about 300 people standing round the hearth eating Annika Toll's bread. The last 200 weight of leg irons, wrist irons, and block chain into the fire in 1 afternoon. Haldun ran it and would not let anybody else near the tongs, and he charged the school for his time, because he is Haldun. The stone block itself is still there. Gara wanted it broken up, and Bram wanted it left, and the argument went on for a fortnight, and Bram won it by saying that a yard which pretends nothing happened in it is a yard that will let it happen again. They set the bench across it. The main bench of the Ashmere School stands on the block that took my hand and about 90 others, and the first thing a new student does is put their tools down on it. Corwin Vale's father came to us in the 5th month, and his name is Elias Vale, and he lost his right hand 31 years ago for a debt of 9 silver. Nobody had ever told me that, and I had never once thought to ask. The son of a marked man had spent 19 years taking hands for the crown and keeping a share of every fine, and had never once mentioned it in any hall in this valley. The old man came on his own, on a stick, at 83 years of age, and he did not come to make a point. He came because his neighbor's son had been fitted in Laro, and had told him what it was like to feel a cup. Corwin Vale brought him. That is the whole of the payment I ever got from that man, and I did not ask for it. He walked his father across the block yard he used to run, in front of a market that has a long memory, and he waited. The crowd did what crowds do. Nobody touched him. Somebody at the back priced the tool chest out loud, and then a woman named the sum his fee would have taken off her family, and then the whole yard was doing arithmetic at him for a long time, while he stood there and looked at the ground. I said nothing at all. I have wanted that man's face in front of a crowd since the first morning of this account, and when I finally had it, I found I did not need to add anything, and I have thought about why ever since. Issa Varick did the fitting, not me. She is a certified tuner of the Stonewick Hall. She was closest to hand that week, and there was no argument about it because Elias Vale's arm needed a shallow collar, and Issa is better at those than I am. It took her 3 hours and 11 minutes. The old man felt his own stick under his hand, and then he cried quietly, which happens more often than the stories about this trade suggest. Corwin Vale paid the school's fee in coin in full at the table, and Mira counted it in front of him and gave him a receipt with his father's name on it. Then he asked me whether we would fit anybody. I told him we fit anybody who consents and who understands the price, and that this had been true on the first day when he took a tool chest out of a yard in front of my sister. Did not answer that. He works as a clerk in Columns Ford now, for wages, and his father comes to the yard twice a year for the collar, and always brings something for the dog. Odo brought the surgeon's ending back from Veirun in the 6th month, and told it to the yard once. Badly, because he had been running and had not eaten. Spenchas dixing for trainets, one do wakis, sane do tarts. The court held Aldous Rhyme to the guarantee he drafted. His yards were sold to pay the first year of it. The Veirun house went with them, and the maintenance of every crown-issued limb passed to a commission of 3 men with a levy behind it. He works for that commission now, at a salary, mending the limbs he sold, which is not a punishment anybody in this yard invented and is the only one that ever fitted him. The indentures went with the yards, and every one of them was struck as unenforceable inside a year. Osric Payne made his offer in the 7th month, and he made it in his own hall, in front of his own members, which is the only way that man has ever done anything. He had spent 2 winters reading his founding charter, and what he had found in it was that the halls certify work and that they had drifted, over about 2 centuries, into licensing people instead, and that the drift had cost them the best craft in the valley. Wren's certifying bench had stamped 409 pieces by then and had trained 11 examiners, none of whom hold a personal license, and every hall in 3 towns had watched work go into her book that the halls could not touch. So Payne offered the school's graduates a probationary seat in his own guild, 3 years, no vote, full examination rights, hall fees at the member rate, and the mark of the Ashmere halls on any work they certify. It is the first time a marked craft has been let through that door since the statute was written. He did not apologize for the notice he nailed up 4 years ago, and I did not ask him to. He told me instead that he had been right then and was right now, and that both of those things could be true at once because the ground under the argument had moved. Wren voted against accepting it. She stood up in her own hall and said that a probationary seat is a permission, that we had been here before with a lord's warrant, and that the school should certify under the charter and let the halls come to it. She lost the vote 9-6. Then she certified the first 4 graduates into Payne's guild herself the following week, because she had lost the vote and that was the end of it, and she made sure the 4 of them knew she had opposed it. We disagree about fees now instead, on the record, at every meeting, in front of everybody. She wants them set high enough that a tuner can live and hire. I want them low enough that a barge hand can walk in off the north bank. We have not settled it. We are not going to settle it. And the argument is written into the minutes 4 times a year by a clerk who finds the whole business very tiring. Bram teaches the drill to a room he cannot count. Set the seat, draw the cable. Close on nothing, close on the cup. Twice a day, at first light and at the turn of the shift, to whoever is standing there. He is 59. He has taught it to about 400 people, and there are now 4 benches where it is taught by somebody he taught, and he keeps a list of the names of the ones who have started teaching it themselves. And that list is the only thing I have ever seen him boast about. Garrow runs the 2nd bench and has not been on a road in 4 years. He designed the graduated collar, the jig that cuts it, and the gauge that checks it, and he has taught 19 people to build all 3. Mira read the register aloud in the yard on the anniversary of the striking, standing on the block with the tally board she has had since she was 15. Nitas Astachar. 1,106 hands fitted at benches of this school. 31 tuners certified, 9 benches running, 6 towns counting the coast road, 240 of those hands fitted by people I have never met. She read her own line last because she wrote the register, and she puts herself where she likes. Registrar of the Ashmere School, appointed by the holding, at a salary she negotiated herself and revised upward twice in front of witnesses. She is 19 now. She was named as security against 11 silver in that yard on a morning when nobody in the crowd thought her worth the ink, and she owns the ground the whole thing stands on. I rode out to the North Bank bench in the 8th month because a wearer there had a collar that would not hold, and I got there 2 days after Issa's second student had already stripped it, found a burr in the thread, filed it out, and reseated the man. They gave me a cup of small beer and let me watch the afternoon shift. Then they fiskas in muffin stew. Nobody asked me anything. On the way home, I worked out that I had not been needed at a bench outside Ashmere for 11 months and had been traveling to them anyway. Pitch died that winter, at about 11 years old, in front of the workshop fire, with the 4th leg Garrow had built him still strapped on. He had worn one for 4 years and had stolen from every person named in this account. Bram buried him under the yard wall where he used to work the queue, and somebody put the first barrel stave leg on a nail above the bench, and it is still hanging there next to the hook. Elias Vale brings a piece of bacon for a dog that is not there anymore, twice a year, and nobody in that yard has yet found a way to tell him. The students built me a hand over that winter and did not say one word about it to me until the whole thing was finished and lying on the bench. Wren carved the socket, Garrow cut the collar and the ring, Issa Varick shaped the jaw and the cable run, and Odo Fenn, who is 18 and has never had a right hand of his own, did the seating, with Issa's hands over his for the first quarter of an hour and then on his own. 2 of them on one arm, working the same seat in turn. That was Garrow's idea, and it took the 4 of them a year to work out, and it is the reason a deep seat no longer costs one person everything they have. It gave me back some of what I had spent, and I want to be exact about how much. My right hand reads texture again. Wood, iron, cloth, the grain of a board, my sister's hair, all of it through iron that 4 other people built. My left hand is still dull in the 2 outside fingers, still blind in the palm, still dead across the back of the wrist. That does not come back. Nobody in that room pretended otherwise, and Mira had already written down what each of the 3 had cost in her own column before any of them started. Naldi examined me twice before she would let them begin, which I found funny at the time, and Odo did not. The first hook is on the workshop wall over the door. Cart pin, Cooper's band, and a harness strap, made in the dark behind a shed by a man who had lost a job and a hand in the same week, and the students hang their aprons on it. Odo left for the coast road in the spring with a tool roll, a certified stamp, and a mule he paid for himself. He can tune. He can teach the tuning. He knows the 4 positions and the collar and the deep seat, and he learned the last of it from Issa and Garrow rather than from me, which means the thing has now passed through 2 sets of hands that were not mine. I asked him at the gate why the coast and not the valley. He said that everybody in this valley already knows what a fitted hand does, and that there are towns on the coast road where a man with no hand still sits against a wall with a bowl, and that he had been that boy and was not going to be polite about it. Then he said the thing I have been trying to arrange for 4 years and could never have said out loud without sounding like a man making a speech. He said that if he did it properly, nobody out there would ever need to know my name. I have a school I do not run, a craft I do not own, a pattern anybody can build, and a register with my sister's signature at the bottom of it. The load in my chest wakes me most mornings before the light, and there is no longer any single person in this kingdom who could stop it if he wanted to.
A man woke up inside a punishment that had already been carried out, in a kingdom that had learned to make money out of taking hands. He did not begin by fighting the law. He began by building one hook that could lift a pail, and then he made the people around him owners instead of debtors, and then he taught the only thing he could not be robbed of to anybody who would sit still and learn it. That is the whole of the lesson, and it costs something. What you build by yourself can be bought, banned, or broken in a night. What you have taught to other people cannot be taken back by anyone.